Right, good evening everybody and welcome to today's meeting of the Customer and Corporate Services and Scrutiny Management Committee. We're here for a specially convened calling-in meeting where we will be discussing the strategic review of the council car parking. A few bits of housekeeping before we get started. So first of all, we're not expecting a fire alarm. So if you do hear a fire alarm, we leave the building by the main exit and assemble down at the front of the building. If you've got your telephone with you, please make sure it's turned off or on silent. And I think everybody in the room pretty much knows where the toilets are, but for anybody who doesn't, it's just through the doors behind me on my left. And if anybody is needing to use that, please feel free to get up during the meeting. So on to apologies for this evening's meeting. We've received two apologies for this evening. One is from Councillor Norman, who will be substituted by Councillor Douglas. The second, and I take no pleasure in saying this, is the Green Party's Councillor Baker has given her apologies for this evening and will be substituted by the Liberal Democrats' Councillor Wan. Now, this arrangement once again gives the Liberal Democrats a voting majority on this committee, despite there not having a voting majority in council. So I'd like to note that this seat is not allocated to the administration. I don't believe it should be treated as such, and therefore wish to formally record once again that whilst I have absolutely no personal issue whatsoever with Councillor Wan, I believe that his attendance at this evening's meeting is contrary to the spirit and purpose of the legislation as it relates to proportionality in scrutiny committees, and as such brings the council into disrepute. I furthermore would like to formally record that I have written to the Chief Operating Officer and the Monitoring Officer saying that I believe that this ongoing debacle not only serves to undermine the democratic institutions of this council, but is symptomatic of a pervasive toxic culture which has only increased since the publication of the public interest report in April this year. I therefore respectfully ask the Liberal Democrat and Green groups to think once again about the messages that they are sending out to the residents of our city in continuing to behave in this manner. My intention for this evening is to just slightly tweak the order of the agenda. So I will just move the minutes forward ahead of public participation, but moving on to the formal agenda of this evening's meeting. Item 1 is declarations of interest. So if anybody has any interest they wish to declare, could you indicate now? Not seeing anybody indicating. So as I say, I want to just bump item 3, the minutes, up to the next item. So I just wanted to make a minor amendment to the minutes for accuracy. I think committee members have all had circulated just a tweak to some wording, which is to replace the existing paragraph 4 of minute number 17 to read, whilst Councillor Douglas was addressing the committee on behalf of calling in members, the chair had to call for a short adjournment to the meeting to receive advice on the presence of Make It York representatives who had made themselves available to join the remote meeting but had not expressly been invited. And continues on with the next paragraph, and then in the final paragraph on that page to replace the word proceed with continue. So aside from that amendment, if everybody's happy that I sign those as an accurate record of the minutes, could you all indicate, please? Thank you very much. So I can now move us on to public participation. We have 6 members of the public registered to speak, and I'll invite them to come and address the committee in turn. I've just slightly tweaked the order of the speakers at the request of one of the speakers. So I'm going to go first to Professor Tony May, who's joining us via Zoom, and asked if he could address the committee first. I'll then take everybody else in the order as they appear on the sheet that you have in front of you. So Professor May, I think you should be on the line now. I know you've spoken a number of times at council, so should be aware it's 3 minutes to address the committee. I'll give you a notice at 30 seconds ahead of the end of that 3 minutes. And if you could try and keep to time as best as possible. If you'd like to start whenever you're ready.
Thank you very much, Chair, and good evening, everybody. I'm speaking on behalf of York Civic Trust, and I should perhaps note that I've been involved in providing advice to cities on parking strategy for almost 50 years now. There appears to be some confusion as to the role of the Council's strategic review of council car parking. We and others have been led to understand that it would offer the review of parking strategy required as input to the new local transport plan. The document considered by the executive may be a helpful review of the council's car parks as assets, but it is seriously incomplete as a review of parking strategy for the city centre. Parking, of course, is an important element of access, but it also provides a means of regulating car use, and the number of spaces, the way they are regulated, and the charges are all central to that. An effective parking strategy needs to start by assessing how much parking is needed in the city centre. This will be determined by the council's economic and carbon strategies, and our own analysis suggests that to meet the carbon target, there may need to be around a 20% reduction in car use, which of course would have implications for parking supply. The strategy then needs to consider all current public parking provision, including that in the private sector, which is crucial in this, and it needs an accurate estimate of current usage by duration and by purpose. The current document does none of these, and the council's existing data is seriously deficient. The report also perpetuates 2 misunderstandings. First of all, if charging is used to regulate car use, as it should be, and less space is needed, this should not lead to a reduction in income. Parking demand is not fully elastic, and therefore if you raise charges, you will get more revenue even if you're using fewer spaces. Secondly, if the council closes some parking space, the private sector will not simply build new facilities. It is not a productive use of scarce city centre land. At the council's request, we submitted advice on how to develop a parking strategy in April, but it appears that the authors were not aware of our recommendations. None of this matters if the council is not using the review to decide on future investment in parking. But the review as it stands is seriously deficient as a basis for deciding on the proposed multi-storey car park in St George's Field. And our strong recommendation is that the council makes clear the limited role of the current report and immediately commissions work on an effective city centre parking strategy. And we, in conclusion, Chair, stand ready to assist with that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor May. I was just about to say that's 30 seconds, as you said in conclusion. So that's very well timed. And I'm sure that committee members will take all of your comments into account when we come to discuss the substantive item. So our next public speaker is in the room. We have Mr. Johnny Hayes, who is also speaking on this called in agenda item. Johnny, I think, again, you know the score. If you'd like to come to the table, start when you're ready, and I will give you a heads up when you've got about 30 seconds left.
Thank you, Chair. I'm really pleased that this review has been called in, because what we've received is simply not a strategic review into parking. It's simply an asset management report. It's light on accurate data on parking due to the long-term faulty car counters in council car parks. It's full of spurious assumptions about income and vague estimates on land values and a lack of knowledge about the city's car parks. The brief is designed to elicit the answers the officer or exec member wanted to hear. The brief was vague by design, in my opinion. Officers have simply created a hierarchy of car parks for future investment and to determine those that might be closed and sold for development. St Mary's and St John's car park are predicted as in the report as possible student accommodation. This report needs careful scrutiny, as it is so misinformed. Some parks are not even included. Moor Lane, 540 spaces, why not? I visited St George's Field today to discover that it's just been extended last Friday. It's gone from 150 car spaces it will now be 252 car parking spaces. This has been confirmed by an email from Parking Services this afternoon. This is a major error. How many more are there in there? Occupancies are loosely estimated by CCTV. COVID impacts are probably miscalculated as people are not using public transport. In November 2020, the St George's Field multi-storey car park went to planning. A motion to approve the application was voted against by councillors, who then voted to defer any decision, to undertake a full review of car parking needs within the city centre. A full review was not provided. Just a few short paragraphs focusing on the need to return £1.2 million income from the castle car parks, with warnings that council tax would need to rise to pay for a loss of income. The income would not be lost. If there is spare capacity elsewhere, cars will find those spaces. Scrutinise this information carefully. Surely this review should follow a local transport plan. This review needs to be well informed, not just a vague estimate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Johnny. You're absolutely spot on the 3 minutes there, clearly well practiced.
Cheers.
Obviously, committee members will take your comments into account when we get to that item. So next speaker we have is Christopher Copland, again speaking on, I'm going to stop saying speaking on agenda item 4, seeing as how we are a single item agenda this evening, but wanting to address the committee. So Mr. Copland, you'll have heard me saying it's 3 minutes to address the committee, and I'll give you a shout when you've got about 30 seconds left. Over to you.
Thank you, Chair. I'm speaking as a long-standing resident of Fishergate, and I will use my 3 short minutes to focus on the 3 questions used in the Tier 2 assessment of the parking review. This assessment compares the development potential of all of the city's car parks, and on the basis of this, identifies St George's Field as a site for the multi-storey. I will argue that both the questions and the answers are flawed, and that this therefore throws doubt on the conclusion of the review. Okay, 3 questions. Question 1. Is the car park outside or accessed directly from the inner ring road in line with strategies to reduce vehicles in the city centre? Answer given is yes. I would point out that in fact, all of the city's car parks fall into this category with the exception of Coppergate. But where St George's Field lies in relation to the A1036 is frankly neither here nor there. The wedge of land between the confluence of the Foss and the Ouse is a cohesive geographical unit and an integral part of the city's historic core. Georgian New Walk, which I've cycled along to get to this meeting, runs between the, the Victorian listed structures of the Ouse Bridge and the court buildings, and then looks over the ancient fields, the medieval gems, the castle and the minster. To place a multi-storey car park here would fragment this historic triangle and invite vehicles into the city's organic centre. Question 2, is the site accessed via a residential area? The surprising answer in the review is no. Many of us here will be aware that the main access route to the fields is Fulford Road, which is lined with dense housing, which is occupied by myself and a number of other people in this room. At, for example, the junction of Fishergate and the Ring Road, there are 2 primary schools, and I understand a proposed accommodation block for nearly 300 students. How Fishergate cannot be defined as a residential area befuddles me. Question 3, does the site have an alternative development use? The answer given is no. My answer would be it does not need an alternative use. It already has one. It is defined by the conservation body as a character area.
That's about 30 seconds left.
The current layout is not entirely satisfactory, but for my last few seconds, I'm going to cite the vision of the architect Alan Simpson 10 years ago in a report given to the council. Development must face the rivers rather than turning its back on them. The area to the south of Tower Street should be reinvented as a grand city park, which will create a new world-class destination. That destination will not be enhanced by a brutalist multi-storey at the heart of the Green Triangle. I yield my time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Copland. And as I say, committee members will take into account all your comments when we get to debating the item. Thank you. So the next speaker we have is Mr. Jamie Wood, who is joining us via Zoom. Jamie, I hope you can hear us. And if you'd like to start in your own time, and you have 3 minutes.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks for the opportunity to speak at this meeting, and my apologies for the confusion I spread regarding my attendance. So I want to speak about the item, and in particular the first two reasons for calling this in regarding the quality and the sufficiency of the evidence base. So in item 57 of the officer recommendations, the existence of an alternative analysis of car parking is mentioned. This erroneously indicates it was done by the York Cycle Campaign and a local resident, when in fact is it a joint document produced by Johnny Hayes, former councillor and speaker here, and a former chair of Indy York, Kate Revillius, a local resident, and myself. I was asked to contribute to provide some data analysis because of my professional skills as a professor of mathematical modelling at the University of York. It also misrepresents that it was solely part of a campaign against the St George's multi-storey car park. The primary data made available to me was a series of spreadsheets containing the counter data from car parks across York. This data was in awful condition, riddled with inconsistencies, and for over half council car parks not being collected at all. Crucially, missing data includes the second floor of Piccadilly, which is sometimes called Coppergate car park, and most extraordinary of all, Castle car park, where it seems the counter stopped collecting data in June 2019. You can see this in figures 2 and 3 in the written submission that I provided to this committee. I want to dwell on this for a moment. We have no robust evidence base for the capacity usage of any council-owned car park in York. Secondly, we have no evidence database to indicate what the excess demand will be if Castle Car Park is closed without replacement, and whether this demand can be met by the existing stock. As capacity data was unavailable, our report attempted to provide a crude proxy by utilising financial data. This data gives no direct capacity information and is also only a coarse average of usage. It cannot provide information about peak usage times, for example. This analysis is broadly repeated in the officer report, but without any context or commentary about its clear insufficiency. The report does contain welcome additional CCTV evidence, but it is only for a limited time period and from a period still in the pandemic, and it does not include Piccadilly Car Park or Coppergate Car Park. In our report, we demonstrated the redistribution of income to alternate car parks by examining the income during the time the Rose Theatre was in place. Such analysis is lacking in the officer report. Notably, Castle Car Park revenue is completely absent. This can be seen in figure 1 in my written submission. For example, this suggests careful consideration of the financial case for additional car parks is required through a period likely to see uncertain transport changes, not least those that emerge from as yet unseen LTP4. This report potentially places crippling and poorly evidenced constraints on LTP4. For example, the arbitrary hierarchy based on inside or outside the ring road, which may or may not be compatible with future transport routing. I therefore urge this scrutiny committee to reject or defer this report until higher quality data is available and evidence-based decisions can then be made on car parking and transport as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jamie. Your comments will be noted. I just want to clarify with you, you've made a couple of references to written submissions, and we're just scrabbling around trying to find them. Can you just tell me who you submitted them to?
I emailed a PDF to all the members of the committee I believe were attending, and in that written submission, there is some extra appendices with 3 figures in them. I can forward them on to somebody immediately now if that helps.
Can I just check with committee members if you've received them? Yeah, committee members have received them. Thank you. It's evidently me as chair that's missed them. All right, but you can be reassured that the committee members all have them. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So on to our next public speaker then is David Harban, who is in the room. And again, David, you'll know the score now. So I'll just hand over to you to start when you like, and I'll give you a heads up when you've got about 30 seconds left.
I wish to raise a question to do with the constitution and good governance of this council. The council's constitution includes a rule which says the council will make copies of the agenda for a meeting and related reports open at least 5 clear days before the meeting. In calculating 5 clear days, the council does not include the day of publication, the day of the meeting, weekends or bank holidays. Papers extending to over 1,000 pages were issued on the 5th of November for your meeting on the 8th of November. That means there were no clear days notice, 0. I wrote to the Director of Governance about this the following day, but did not get a reply to my email. I therefore raised a Freedom of Information request asking the council who disapplied the 5-day rule on this occasion. I received the following reply. The information is not held. However, to assist with your understanding, whilst we accept the information was published outside the stated timescales, no decision was made to disapply this rule. We apologise that we did not meet the agreed targets on this occasion. Let me repeat, no decision was taken to disapply this rule. This was a serious breach of the Constitution and a clear case of poor governance. The consequences are clear. The Scrutiny Committee was unable to give due consideration to the Martin Higgett Associates report, not least because it was not explicitly drawn to your attention. You were not told and did not know on the 8th of November that the MHA recommendations were at odds with recommendations put forward by officers. In particular, you did not consider whether Goodrham Gate and Collier Gate should be reopened to blue badge holders as recommended by MHA. Nor did you consider changing the Foot Street hours of operation. The consultation that ended on the 25th of October showed that blue badge holders are strongly in favour of starting Foot Street hours later than 10:30 and ending them earlier than 7 p.m. Again, the results of the consultation were buried in the 1,000-page report and not explicitly drawn to this committee's attention. Your meeting on the 8th of November clearly contravened the council constitution and should not have taken place on that date. In light of that, I would call upon the decisions taken by the council executive on the 18th of November to be set aside so that the decision-making process can be rerun properly, starting with a fresh meeting of the Scrutiny Committee and ample time to consider the reports that you had presented to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and you're within your time. What I will do with your comments, because obviously this evening's meeting we're talking about the strategic parking review, I'll pick them up with both the monitoring officer and statutory scrutiny officer who are sat on either side of me here. We'll make sure that there is a response to you. If there's any fallout or consequence from the points that you raise, then obviously we'll report that back either via this committee or in response to you directly. Thank you. And so move us on to the final speaker this evening, who is Greg Marsden, who I believe is in the room, but I'm not seeing anybody jumping up.
I'm online.
Oh, I apologies. I can't see, it does say that you're via Zoom and I've just not read it properly, my apologies. So Greg, you'll have seen and heard, you have 3 minutes to address the committee. If you'd like to start in your own time, and I'll give you a heads up at 30 seconds.
Thanks. Hi, I'm a Professor of Transport Governance at the Institute for Transport Studies at the University of Leeds. I'm a resident of York. My research covers climate, energy policy and parking policy I've been working on for the last 20 years or so. As set out earlier by Professor May, my view is that as a strategic review, the document is deficient. In order to understand the need for parking supply, one has to know what's anticipated in terms of demand. I have yet to see a climate compliant transport strategy that doesn't require at least a 20% reduction in travel demand. And therefore, I think the statement on page 20 that car park strategy is going to be informing Local Transport Plan 4 is the wrong way round. Local Transport Plan 4 must precede a strategic review of what's needed in terms of parking. As noted before, also, were it to be a strategic review of parking, it would have to include all parking, of which the City Council's parking is one part, albeit an important part of parking in the city. It is a supposition that any reduction in parking provided by the council would be filled by other private sector providers. In fact, I can recall examples of private sector provision being withdrawn within the city in recent memory. In terms of data, I also feel that although it's a very difficult period for data collection, the COVID effects are poorly understood. Summer 2021 was always likely to be higher than summer 2019. There's been significant domestic holidaying in this period relative to usual, which is more likely to be car-based than the international visitors which York usually attracts, and therefore one would anticipate car parking revenue would be up. I'm also unclear about the chart on page 10, which talks about average peak occupancy. The period and duration of the peak occupancy is missing from there. So is that 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours a day, a month? We're absolutely unclear on that. As a strategic review, although on occasions it talks about just being about parking, I think it also oversteps the mark in terms of suggesting that future local transport plan funds should be used to fund upgrades to the car park or to fund variable message signage. There's no evidence on the social, economic or environmental benefits of spending money on these other options. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Greg. Again, your comments will be noted, and I'm sure that members will be taking them into account when we come to discuss this item. So that brings us to the end of public participation. So I can now move us on to agenda item 4. Just before I do, I just want to note that we've also had a couple of other written submissions from residents which were circulated to members in advance of this meeting. So I hope that you've all had the opportunity to read those. In terms of how the meeting will progress then from this stage, I'm just going to talk us through what we'll be doing. And I'd like to just start by being very clear, because obviously the way that the papers have been presented to us this evening are a copy of the papers that originally went to executive, which talk about both the city centre access and the parking strategy. It's just the parking strategy that we're looking at this evening. So whilst there are references to parking through the papers, it sort of begins in earnest at page 25 from paragraph 42 onwards. And then obviously you've got annexed the actual parking strategy review. So 2 items have been called in. The decisions taken on the 18th of November, decision 3, that the strategic review of council car parking and associated action plan access annex 2 be approved, and decision 4, that it be noted that a future report on whether to recommence the paused procurement of a contractor to build St George's Field multi-storey car park will be brought to executive as part of a wider delivery update on the Castle Gateway project in February 2022. So what I'm going to do for this meeting, we'll first of all invite the calling in members to come and speak to the committee to make their case and then answer some questions. We'll then invite the 2 relevant executive members to come and give their reasoning for their decision and again answer any questions. We'll then invite officers to come to the table and answer any technical questions and provide any additional background information. And again, there'll be opportunity to ask any further questions of officers. We'll then have some debate on the merits of the call-in and any further points that anybody wishes to make before then moving on to any proposals about whether or not we wish to uphold or reject the call-in, and then ultimately take a vote on that. So if I could first invite Councillor Kilbane up to the table to speak to the committee on the calling in. Nominally, you have 3 minutes to address the committee, but with 2 executive members present to do the second part, I will be a little bit lenient if you go over your 3 minutes, but don't push your luck too far if you don't mind. And then obviously we'll ask questions if we have any.
Okay, thank you, Chair, members. This review, parking review, came about as in November 2020, the Planning Committee deferred the council application to build a multi-storey car park on St George's Field in order, and I quote, to undertake a full review of car parking needs within the city centre, how that will potentially impact the need for car parking spaces. In other words, whether or not we actually needed the amount of parking the council was applying to build. The review, agreed by Councillor de Gorn as Transport Exec in April 21, started to give officers wriggle room to sidestep the issue of parking capacity by focusing on investment and improvements. However, that executive member decision does note the centrality of this city centre parking review to establishing the case for St George's Field multi-storey. That decision session also noted that COVID creates uncertainty as to long-term parking demand and that now is not the right time to identify parking capacity, but that somehow the review would still create a reliable evidence base for decision-making. The first 2 points are incompatible with the latter and moved the review away from its original purpose. As such, it was skewed from the outset and cannot be used as the basis for a decision on the St George's Field multi-storey. Even within this skewed remit, the review fails to provide accurate data on parking use across council-managed car parks, without which you cannot establish a reliable evidence base for decision-making. We still don't know if we need more or less parking capacity. The closest we get is reports from CCTV footage from which data for Piccadilly multi-storey, the natural replacement for Castle Car Park, is missing. This is not data upon which a decision can be made as to the suitability of a multi-storey on St George's Field, and therefore the report has failed in its aim to provide critical evidence to the executive when making this decision. Officers have used the wiggle room given to them by Councillor de Gorn to the max and have transformed this report from an assessment of parking capacity into one that assesses car parks as land assets. Decisions on parking should be governed by the emerging local transport plan and climate change strategies, not just economic development and planning, which is clearly prioritised in this report. The review also makes claims that are simply not supported by evidence or tell only half the story. For example, it blithely asserts that if council does not provide parking, commercial operators will. This claim cannot be made without understanding the demand for parking, which this review singularly fails to address and totally ignores the role of CUIC as a planning authority, which is strange, as that appears to be the council's sole strategy to influence the whole of York Central. The review also highlights revenue from car parks, not the cost of running them, and assumes that this level of income needs to be maintained regardless of other policies. In short, the review has been set up to find the answers that the executive wants to hear, giving the green light to press ahead with the St George's Field multi-storey, the approval of which Councillor Eyre described as fantastic news and providing parking to replace the closure of Castle Car Park, even though we still don't know if that parking needs replacing. Councillor also said that the Green Lib Dems would develop the local transport plan before we start building on St George's Field. We hope he is as good as his word. This report should be returned to the executive and they should instruct officers to ensure that accurate and robust data is available before any decisions are made. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Councillor Kilbane. So I'll invite any members who wish to ask Councillor Kilbane any questions behind the reasoning for the call, and if you'd like to indicate now. Councillor Fenton.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Councillor Kilbane. Just looking at the called-in decision, which was the strategic review of council car parking and associated action plan. And on pages 28 and 29 of the report pack, there's some bullets that summarise some of the actions associated with the strategic review. I just wondered whether there were any of those proposed actions that you disagree with. I'm trying to understand whether it's the strategic review that you're most unhappy about, or the associated actions as well. Is 28 and 29, have you got the same?
Yeah, I've got 28 and 29, but the review itself is inadequate. It's not a strategic review of parking, it's an assessment of car parks as land assets. And I think, the case for that has been made far more eloquently by speakers here tonight.
Thank you. Councillor Pearson was next, and then Councillor Douglas, unless that was supplementary, Councillor Douglas. No.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Councillor Kilbane. Do you disagree with the report hierarchy in terms of putting people and communities above assets and incomes?
and when did you stop beating your wife? I disagree with the whole premise of the strategic review in the way that it is, the things that it has prioritised in the hierarchy. So we need to look at this in the round. So, for example, there's no measurement of air quality in there. There's no measurement of carbon emissions, as we've heard. There's no attempt to try and meet climate change targets, etc. Of course, we want to put communities first. I think we'll all want to do that, Councillor Pearson. But I don't think this particular review is doing that. You heard from one of the speakers tonight how the road in the area that he lives has not been classed as residential, which, if you were worried about communities, then you would be classing that as residential.
Thank you. Councillor Douglas.
Thanks, Chair. Councillor Kilbane, can you give us a summary of the impacts of getting this right? So car parking review obviously has impacts across the city in a number of areas, and if we get it right, the benefits for a number of stakeholders and activities in the city should benefit. I just wondered what you thought the greatest benefits would be of getting this review right at this point in time. Thanks.
I tend to agree with some of the academic speakers tonight that actually what this review is doing is putting the cart before the horse, and what we really need to have is a local transport plan, and the strategic review of parking should be informing a local transport plan. Is a much more sort of joined up way of doing it. If we get the local transport plan right, then that should reduce the amount of car journeys that have been made on the road, which should make the roads much better for everybody who needs to use them. It should reduce the amount of traffic going through people's communities, which should make it better for the people who live there. If we get the local transport plan right, then we should be making ease of movement around the city a lot better for everyone, because at the moment it's a total nightmare. But, you know, interestingly, looking at the data, I can't work. I mean, I understand that this was a really odd year for looking at how much space we needed in our council car parks. So we had a lot of people do it on staycations, so people would drive into the city instead of flying into an airport or getting a train. We had a lot of people moving off public transport. We've had half of Marygate, we've had half of St George's Field closed for flood works, and even yesterday, where there was traffic chaos in the city, that at one point, if the counters are to be believed, around about 11:30 in the morning, there was still 170 spare car parking spaces in Piccadilly car park yesterday, when anybody that was in town yesterday would know it was absolutely heaving, and there was queues of traffic everywhere, has been for the last couple of days. So there's clearly a mismatch between the parking and the traffic movements, and that's what we need to get right. Now, the strategic parking review is supposed to inform that. I was on the planning committee that called for an assessment of how much parking we needed, and we wanted to know that answer because we were being asked to approve a multi-storey car park next to all our historic monuments. Now, before you do that, it's a good idea to know whether or not you need those parking spaces. You know, if I'm running a restaurant, I will make considered decisions whether to expand the business or maybe make the business smaller, depending upon what I gauge to be the level of demand. You know, that's what I'll be looking at. I won't be looking at the particular values of the tables or how near to the door they are when trying to make that decision. You know, you think about those things running a business, but it's not the most important thing. It's about supply and demand, isn't it? The difference with, and we don't know what that is, we don't know what the demand is, which just seems to me crazy that we can have a parking review, but not try and assess how much parking we need. I know it's going to be difficult to predict, and I know that we've had funny years, but if you're going to do it, you need to take that into account, or I don't think there's any value in doing it at all.
Thank you. Councillor One.
Thank you, Chair. In the fourth call-in point, it talks about private car parking. Do you think it's reasonable that private car parking operators will provide data on car parking usage to the council, or do you think it might be something that's business sensitive?
I would suggest if businesses in York would be unwilling to share such information with the council, then we've got bigger issues. We've got serious issues of lack of trust with the council. There should be no reason at all why those businesses wouldn't share that information without thinking that the council would use it to somehow do them out of business. We should be working in partnership with those organisations.
Councillor Rowley.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Councillor Kilbane. It's a similar question along the lines that's just been asked you about private car parks. The omission of important private car park data in this report is clear. How important do you feel that information, not just on private car parkings, but on other commercial car parks that are available at certain times of the year? And I appreciate that obviously collation of that information might be difficult, but you know, I'm aware that there are a number of industrial units around the city relative to the city centre where there are lots of spare places that people can park and do park and did over the weekend. So I'm just curious as to your thoughts on the omission of really important private car parking data.
Just to go back to my previous analogy, if I was thinking of expanding the restaurant, then what I'd do is have a walk down the street and see what all the other restaurants are doing. You know, because if they were all empty, I'd be starting to think, well, hang on a minute, maybe there's not such a big demand for restaurants around here. So, you know, you need to have that conversation with them. Otherwise, you're only looking at half the picture. And I do appreciate it's difficult where you've got people renting out their drives for people to park on and all that kind of stuff. But what I can guarantee you is that those commercial operators will know what capacity their car parks are operating at because they're in it to make some money. And that evidence is absolutely crucial to know if you're making any money out of your car parking. I mean, on another level, it's far more alarming that we don't have that information as a council, because we don't really know if we're maximising the return we could be getting on parking from the car parks that we own. And also in the report, it talks about £7 million worth of revenue without taking into account at all the costs of running that business. So we don't really know, what the net gain is. If it is a business that you can run without any costs or overheads, then, it's a business I'd look to getting into, but I very much doubt it. I should imagine the actual net gain to the council is a lot less, but the problem is, we struggle to know.
Thank you. Councillor Orrell.
Thank you. The fourth recommendation was from the executive was to note the report. They didn't actually make a decision. So what would you like this committee to do when they send it back to if they sent it back to the executive, what would, they can't unnote the decision, the recommendation, what would you expect them to do?
Well, I think, Councillor Orrell, they could note that the report is not worthy of the aims that it's trying to achieve. So what I would suggest they do, is they can note the report but acknowledge its deficiencies. And I think this committee should be pointing out those deficiencies to the executive, and those gaps really need to be filled.
Thank you. Councillor Fenton.
Just to follow up to that, what I think Councillor Orrell was referring to was decision 4 on the call-in note, which was that it be noted that a future report on whether to recommence the paused procurement of a contractor to build the multi-storey car park be brought to executive. So I think what Councillor Orrell is probably getting at is executive noted that there will be a future report. So what? So if of the 2 called-in elements, if that was sent back, what would you expect executive to do?
I think that gives this committee and the executive the opportunity to make sure that any subsequent report has got sufficient data in it to be able to make a decision on the parking needs for the city, but that also takes into account the aims of the local transport plan, which is emerging, the aims of the climate change strategy, which is emerging, that also takes into account our net carbon zero targets that we've set for 2030, which, as we've heard tonight, means a 20% reduction in car journeys. All those things need to be taken into account. There is an opportunity there for that report to be forthcoming, though why those issues wouldn't be in this report, I don't know, unless you were trying to avoid them.
Thank you. I'm not seeing any further indications for questions. So if I could just invite you very briefly, Councillor Kilbane, just to perhaps summarise what it is that you'd like this committee to do. You've sort of alluded to it already, but if you could just give us a kind of a quick overview of what you're hoping to achieve from the call-in this evening.
I would like this committee to acknowledge that there are deficiencies within the strategic parking review, that it is not a document upon which decisions can be based, particularly around the potential multi-storey car park on St George's Field. And I would like this committee to ask the executive to seek further, more robust and accurate evidence along all the lines that I've outlined, which will be capacity as much as you can establish it at the moment, that will take into account our other policies, climate change, local transport plan, carbon net zero, etc., before making that decision.
Thank you very much, Councillor Kilbane. Thanks for your time this evening. And if I could now invite Councillor Eyre as the Executive Member for Finance and Performance and Councillor de Gorn as Executive Member for Transport to come to the table. I don't know if you're both wanting to address the committee separately, or one of you wants to take a lead in one go. I gave Councillor Kilbane around 4 minutes on the basis that that gave you a couple of minutes each to address the committee, or if one of you wants to take a little bit longer and one of you just they'd be there to answer questions, I'm happy either way. So over to you.
Thank you. Well, if I start, then Councillor Eyre can sort of add to anything that I've not covered. So my understanding is that the call-in relates specifically to the parking elements of a strategic review of city centre access and parking. The process being for the committee to decide whether there are grounds to make specific recommendations to the executive relating to our decisions on November the 18th. On that basis, I intend to focus on the strategic review and action plan, as the other item, as you've heard, has no action and is merely noting the proposed timing for a future report in February 2022. Report scope and methodology, which I approved in April 21, which wasn't called in at the time, referred to a decision on the car park in October of this year. So clearly, I would note that proposing a timing is not a commitment to a specific month for a decision in any case. So for the call-in concern centres on decisions which have not yet been made as being premature. So looking at the action plan, which the call-in councillors want to challenge, that's the one which specifically was a decision. This stated that allowing for an improved evidence base this was stated as allowing for an improved evidence base to guide wider strategic decisions in LTP4. I thought that's what the call-in councillors wanted. Specific actions that are listed, and I'll just sort of summarise some of them in the action plan, which was approved, include reinstating vehicle counters, making use of the bid insight data to understand customer origin and spending patterns, which might actually address some of the concerns about non-council car parks, further rollout of EV charging, and feasibility of options to enhance the benefit of park and ride sites. All of these actions, which would surely help to achieve the evidence base, which the calling councillors say is deficient. So I would be interested to know which of these actions the calling councillors are unhappy with and wish to be reconsidered by the executive through the process of calling them in, since that's the main substance of the decisions that were taken. It seems to me the opposition is either way too slow off the mark and meant to call in the original scope for strategic review, which I approved back in April, or else it's jumping the gun on a decision which might be taken sometime in 2022 and more appropriately will be dealt with by pre-decision call-in once that report has been written. The reality is that this is more about political building car parks sound bites than grown-up decisions that face this administration. Our intention being to realise a long-held vision by closing a car park.
You've had 3 minutes.
No, closing,
give you a bit longer, but
which has been a blot on our heritage for over 50 years. I want to know what the opposition would like to see in that world-class public space that we propose. It's worth reminding everyone that if the executive decides to proceed with the construction of the flood-resilient replacement car park in St George's Field with a net loss of 100 spaces, this would be in line with the strong support expressed at the planning decision from both York Bid and York Museums Trust. But that's not a debate for tonight. That is when the noted future report comes back to the executive next year. Thank you.
thank you. And sorry to interrupt you. I just wanted to make sure there was a little bit of time if Councillor Eyre wanted to add any comments. So you've got about a minute or so if you want to make any brief comments, but obviously there may be questions for you as well.
Thank you, Chair. Happy to be very brief. I thought I might be here for eye candy, which would be a bit worrying, but I'll focus on the asset side of things in terms of what they were just literally point to the decisions that were made. Decision 3 is that the review would inform future decisions on which car parks could be used for alternative uses. The review does that. There are other ways to do it. That's absolutely right. But I'm old enough to remember back in 2011 when we proposed closing Union Terrace car park with absolutely no background whatsoever, and 20,000 people signed a petition. So this is a massive step forward in 10 years that we actually have an evidence base to start to have those conversations, not the final end of that conversation, but the start of that conversation. And number 4, which is the one that was most bizarre for me, that it notes the future report will come to executive, as Councillor Orwell and Councillor Fenton have alluded to, it seemed common sense that any move on St George's Field car park and any multi-storey car park would have a report. So I was happy to note that a report would be coming rather than the opposite, which would seem to be a decision was made on the car park with no report, which would seem a little bit odd. So that part of the call-in, I think, was probably a little confused.
Thank you very much, Councillor Eyre. I just want to, just for a point of clarity before I invite questions, Councillor de Gunn, you mentioned pre-decision call-in. We don't have pre-decision call-in anymore, but we do obviously have the opportunity to do pre-decision scrutiny. It's a bit of a technicality, but they're different processes. So just so that everybody's clear.
Well, yeah, it wasn't my choice that we got rid of it, but there you go.
If only you were in power, eh? If any members would like to ask any questions of the exec members, if you could indicate now, and I will take you in the order. So Councillor Douglas.
Thank you, Chair. Councillor Kilbane was quite clear that the call-in was around the quality of the strategic review of council car parking and how that he felt that impacts decision-making and the quality of decision-making. And we heard from two quite eminent professors this evening who seem to have similar views. Both Jamie Wood and Greg Marsden are experts in their field and raise similar concerns. I just wonder what you would like to say to them about their assessment of the quality of the data that has gone into this element of decision making. Thank you.
I mean, I would point you to the executive summary of the report, and that says the strategic review of council car parking has two primary purposes. The first is to provide an assessment of council-owned car parks in the city and create a hierarchy of those car parks to inform and prioritise immediate investment decisions. The second is to identify information gaps in car park usage that can be improved to guide future evidence-based decision-making in LTP4. It has done that. Those public speakers have raised the fact, council officers raised the fact that we have identified information gaps in car park usage, and it's being addressed. That was the point of the review, stated in the executive summary.
Councillor Douglas.
So you've got nothing to say about the areas of deficiency that they highlighted within the report that they believe leads to poorer decision making?
Well, no decision has been made, so you can't say it has led to poor decision making because the decision is in February. In essence, what Councillor Kilbane was doing as part of his summary was to criticise a report that isn't even on the forward plan yet, let alone been written. So you can't say that the information leading to the decision is poor because there's no decision and no information leading to the decision has actually happened yet. If when the report comes out in January, those issues that have been raised tonight haven't been addressed, then you are more than welcome to raise those in terms of that actual report.
I'll just, for a point of clarity, just be clear. So the strategic review, these are the two decisions. The strategic review of the council car parking and associated action plan be approved. So you've decided that you approve this strategic review as it currently exists. That's the first point. And then the second point on the second item that's been called in, I think it might be worth just noting the reason. The reason for that decision being taken was to consider whether to proceed with St George's Field multi-storey car park in light of the outcomes of the strategic review of council car parking. So your two decisions together, and I note that there's a bit of splitting of hairs going on. I think my understanding of the reason behind the call-in is to say the decision has approved the strategic review of car parking, and as a result of that approved parking plan or strategic review, you're then happy to put onto the forward plan that the decision to proceed or otherwise with St George's Field will take place based on the review of car parking that you've just approved. And so I think the point that's being raised again and again by members of the public and by Councillor Kilbane and again by Councillor Douglas here is to say, if the strategic review is deficient, and it's been set out in quite some detail, various reasons for why it may be deficient, are you satisfied that you can A, accept it, and B, move on to making a decision about development of a multi-storey car park. And I think that's why those two items are there.
That's assuming that the decision on the multi-storey car park is based on nothing other than this paper, which it clearly isn't. This paper is a starting point. Am I happy to accept it based on those deficiencies? Yes, on a report that says there are deficiencies and we will look to address those deficiencies as part of the strategic document. That will be done between now and any report coming on St George's Field in February at the earliest. Any other information and significant amount of other information will come into that report. This is not, the sole basis, it's not a case of, as this calling kind of assumes, this document is done, nothing else ever happens to it, and officers will turn up in February and go, there's a report, make a decision on the multi-storey car park. That's not the case. This is a strategic review. It sets in place, it highlights where we need to get more information ahead of any decision on St George's Field. That work will happen and a report will be written based on some of this, significant amount of further work, a robust business case, and all sorts of things that happen in the process. We were talking about premature, and I think the calling calls about premature. The one thing that is premature is the calling.
Thank you. So just to be clear, and I welcome you, Councillor Douglas, I think you had a supplementary, and I'm noting the substantive questions that are coming up as well. But just to be clear, you are approving a strategic plan or a strategic review of car parking, which you accept is based on data that may be inaccurate or be missing, with the view that you will subsequently come along and sort it all out before you get any further down the line.
I can't reiterate all enough. I suspect some people need to read more of this document. I mean, the outcomes listed on report A, evidence base, collect all the existing available data, identify and implement measures to improve future evidence base. What you're asking us to do is improve the future evidence base, which is what the review actually itself is saying it wants to do. So the call-in agrees with the strategic parking review and then says overthrow the strategic parking review. It is somewhat muddled.
I think that I feel a little bit like I'm defending a call-in here, and I'm trying not to. I'm trying to get to the nub of where things are. But I think, but again, do please correct me if I'm wrong, that in approving the strategic review of car parking, what you are approving is the hierarchy of the car parking. So there's a hierarchy that's set out that sets out how the investment will be proceeding within the car parking assets that we have in the city. And I believe, if I've understood correctly, what the public speakers and Councillor Kilbane have said is that in order to reach that decision making about the hierarchy of the car parking, you've applied data which is either insufficient or inaccurate, or is misleading, particularly in terms of things like the revenue that is generated by particular car parks. Are you understanding that in a slightly different way than I'm understanding that?
Can I mean, we've all got this document here in front of us, page 40, review methodology. 4 objectives identified in the review of council car parking. The first one of those is provide an improved evidence base for future decision making. Identify strategic priority council car parks, optimise and future-proof council car parks, and so on. And then when you look at page 56, which is the action plan, recommendation, the main recommendation with a load of bullet points underneath says, having assessed the existing evidence bases and car parks, it's identified the following key improvements would allow an improved evidence base to guide wider strategic decisions in local transport plan 4. Improve the customer offer and experience in council car parks and encourage the take-up of ultra-low emission vehicles and use of park and ride. So those are clearly objectives which will be part of LTP4, set out as part of the action plan, which then leads to the bullet points that I referred to earlier about things like reinstating vehicle counters, using other forms of data which we might get through cooperation with the bid. Those sorts of additional data which will all contribute towards that evidence base, which is part of LTP4, but also part of a decision, depending on how far we've got, when we make the decision on the St George's Field car park. So that is the action plan, which you've said is inadequate and should be sent back. So I don't quite understand the rationale for calling it in at this stage. I think it's basically you missed the opportunity in April, and now you're trying to cover your tracks.
In terms of the hierarchy,
just 1 second, just to be clear, I'm here as the chair of this meeting, it's not me calling this decision in, it's the calling in members who call in the decision, and it's for committee members to make a decision about upholding the call-in or otherwise. Councillor Wright.
And in terms of the hierarchy, again, correct me if I'm not sure anyone has really been that critical of the hierarchy process. There have been issues raised about whether the application of the hierarchy has been done correctly. So, for example, number 5, which is access to a residential area, the speaker didn't say that's not an appropriate question to ask as part of that hierarchy. He questioned whether it had been applied properly. And again, the information you're saying about the data usage is not about saying the hierarchy is wrong necessarily. The calling members may be saying the hierarchy is wrong and want to move it around, but that's not what the calling says. It's questioning whether the data that's then plugged into the hierarchy is sufficient to be able to make a decision. But no decision has been made. Do I think that that's a robust enough data in there to make a decision on St George's Field? No, I don't think there's enough data in this review. As I said, that's why any report will have significantly more. Is there enough data in there to decide whether or not, if we've only got £10,000 to do new white lining, which car parks should get the new white lining above others? Yes, I think there probably is enough information in the hierarchy to allow that level of decision, but any more significant decisions would never be taken based purely on this. But if people do want to change the hierarchy around, then again, I would point to pages 26 and 27. Is it part of a sustainable transport system? Has it been identified for closure? Is it in or outside the ring road? And I know that was questioned previously, but we have passed a motion to reduce unnecessary travel within the ring road. That's why that criteria is in there. That reflects the council motion. Is it assessed to a residential area? Does it have an alternate development use? That is something you do need to look at. Land value, the current usage, current surface and parking. Does it have toilets and an EV strategy? I think that is a robust hierarchy if applied correctly. And if there are issues with the data, which the review said there are issues with the data, we can improve that. That may well lead to a change in the following page, which is page 28 of how hierarchy thing. That may change in terms of data being updated. But unless I'm wrong, nobody's really saying that there are other things in there that need to be included or shouldn't, or ones that are there that shouldn't be included.
Thank you. So I'm just going to summarise who I've got. Councillor Douglas is waiting on a supplementary and I sort of jumped in, so I will come to you with the supplementary if you want it. I've then got Councillor Fenton, Councillor Musson and Councillor Pearson, all with substantive questions, and I'll come to you all in the order that your hands have gone up. But Councillor Douglas, I don't know if you had a further supplementary on that.
Thank you. Yes, on the quality of the data, so you say you're going to review it. Is there a plan to widen the breadth of the study around car parking and include private, the full breadth of our provision in the city, including private provision? Thank you.
We will always aim to include as much information as we possibly can. I don't necessarily agree with Councillor Kilbane that commercial operators will be fantastically optimistic to tell us all of their information and their data on how much is being used and what they're charging, etc. I think it would put their business in a significant financial problem if they were to do things like that. So I doubt it, but you will always ask the question. I'm sure officers have already asked the question. We get as much information as we can, but we cannot force private operators to declare their business model.
Councillor Pearson, was that a supplementary that you, yeah, I'll come to you, and is that another supplementary as well?
Thanks, Chair, and I don't know if you'll have the answers to this on the top of your head, but just on the point around private parking, I imagine we are a competitor to private parking and will be subject to competition law. And I imagine that private operators wouldn't want to share their data, and they certainly wouldn't want it published in a public report, certainly not at a disaggregate level.
I'll suggest we are probably the primary competition for most of those companies. And I think something else Councillor Kilbane said about overhead costs. I think, as we all know from supermarkets especially, there is very limited overhead costs to some parking. You put up an ANPR camera, and if someone stays over 2 hours, you charge them 80 quid. It doesn't take a lot of back office functioning to generate huge amounts of income from that least desirable of the private car parking operators, should I say.
I think Councillor Rowley has a supplementary and Councillor Douglas is deferred.
Thank you, Chair. For both gentlemen, really, just on the subject of private car parking, I totally understand that commercial operators excuse me, may be reluctant to give you what they deem to be sensitive data, given the competitive nature of us as a provider of parking. However, we should be able to know how many parking spaces are provided commercially. And so any future report whilst it may not be able to give us the usage of those spaces, we should be able to get a very clear understanding of how many spaces private and commercial providers have. And I would suggest that it may be possible to have some sort of mean average of our usage and their usage. So I would encourage you and the officers to do all that they can to ensure that any future report at least has reference to the number of private spaces that are provided.
Fully agree, but the thing I would probably caveat with that is, depends what we're referring to as usable spaces. So part of that business model may be contract parking, for example. So some of those private operators may be signing commercial deals with businesses in the city centre to provide X amount of spaces for hotels, etc. So it won't necessarily always know how many of those are sort of on a walk-up basis.
Sorry, yeah, you and again, you will be aware of this, but every single parking space that a commercial operator has is assessed for business rates. So even through your business rates office, you should be able to know how many spaces, because they are rateable. So you should be able to have that information, and your officer should be able to find that, even though the provider may be reluctant to tell you.
I just reiterate that I apologize. People don't walk up to a car park. That was one of the most ridiculous things I've said. But I sort of mean those available for people who are coming on a sort of pay and display basis.
Yeah.
So if you're trying to look at that sort of that tourist offer and say, well, actually, how many spaces on a Saturday afternoon do we have for people visiting the city? There may be 350 car parking spaces in that car park, but they may have an agreement for 150 of those to be permanently kept to one side for a business that has offices nearby, for example. I don't know. I've never run a car park. I will not declare an interest in that. That's my speculation.
I'll just add to that, but it's not a sort of set quantum in any case. I mean, in the last year, I'm aware like Roundtree's Wharf have just stuck up some notice, put in a retrospective application for planning consent. There's last weekend, following the planning meeting, apparently the sign's gone up on Mecca Bingo. You know, they've got a car park, it's there, just sign up saying how much you're charging to come in. You know, so at any one point in time, there can be new places opening and other places closing down.
Okay, I'm going to move us on to Councillor Fenton now. Oh, is that a supplementary? Apologies. Councillor Douglas and then Councillor Fenton, I'll come to you.
Yeah, sorry, still on data. The public speakers also mentioned the importance of demand modelling within a strategic review of council car parking. If we're going to fully understand what our businesses and economic activity in the city requires in that respect, is there any plan to include that and also to get accurate data about the usage of our car parks? So, for example, Piccadilly floor 2, I understand, isn't included in the numbers, neither is the Castlegate car park. So, you know, these elements are all raised by the public speakers, and I wondered if they're things that you're going to look at improving the data, as you mentioned earlier.
I would allude to the fact that all of that is in the action plan. So if the action plan goes ahead, yes, but at the moment you're wanting us to throw out the action plan that would do the very thing that you're asking to be done.
Okay, Councillor Fenton.
Thank you, Chair. Throughout the conversation this evening, reference has been made to local transport plan 4 and its interaction with the strategic review of council car parking and the action plan. I was wondering, it's probably one for Councillor de Gorn. How do you see the action plan informing the development of LTP4? Because there's been some discussion about what the right way round is to do all of this. But in terms of, obviously, the action plan is one of the called in elements. It'd be helpful to understand your take on it.
Well, certainly the overall transport strategy, which will be in LTP4, and as I referred to previously, the action plan specifically states that is one of the aspects that will be considered. The information that's gathered from this process will actually help to inform the whole transport strategy. Car parking is only one element of transport, and quite clearly, you know, as the changes that have taken place following the pandemic will have influenced travel behaviour, it's really important for us to reinstate our park and ride as the preferred means of accessing the city centre for people coming from outside of the city, or other means of public transport. But that is something which has to be part of the overall mix of transport provision within the city. And I would just also sort of remind everyone, although this is not what we're discussing, I appreciate it's not what we're discussing now, but we are talking not just about a decision on a new car park, we're talking about removing a blot on our heritage, which has been there for over 50 years. We're actually closing, the proposal is to close a car park and reduce the overall council parking space provision as part of that process. But the question really is, we have to make changes in a phased way that ensure that the economic, social aspects, as well as our transport and carbon impacts, are taken into account.
I'm just going to make an observation there, and I think that it's one of the things that struck me with looking through some of this report. I'm a little bit concerned that we conflate the removal of Castle Car Park with the building of St George's Field Car Park as a one replacement for the other, and somehow if we don't do one, then we don't get the other. Because actually, surely the point of a really well-researched and thorough strategic car parking plan would be to give us a really clear indication as to whether one or other or both or none are needed. And I think that one of the points that's being made to an extent, or certainly in a questionnaire from Councillor Fenton and certainly by other speakers, is if you are basing your car parking strategy on the current usage of car parking based on the current transport of the city, that is different and distinct from a transport strategy which has clear aims to reduce non-essential car use and other things, and therefore the demand that you may seek to be meeting may not be accurate. And I suppose the nub of it for me is about that data, but also I'm just slightly concerned. There's one or two statements in the report here which I will come to ask officers about. I'm not expecting you to answer particularly at the moment, but that conflation between Castle Car Park and the benefits of removing Castle Car Park, and therefore somehow we have to have the St George's Field multi-storey car park, is the bit that I'm worried about, and I think is probably the bit that a number of the speakers are worried about as well. So I would welcome your comments on that.
Can I just sort of respond to that by saying that if you read the strategic review, that is the whole purpose of looking at all of the car parks that meet the criteria that have been adopted. The starting point within the work that was done was the presumption that Castle Car Park is closing. The decision on that, about creating that as public space, has been made. That's why that's not been analysed in terms of its potential replacement value for other things and so on, because that is not part of the equation. But all the other car park sites have been looked at in terms of, if you say you want to have a 20% reduction, like the speakers made, points the speakers made, if you say you want to have a 20% reduction to meet our carbon targets, then which ones would be top priority for us to dispose of on the basis of the different criteria that have been taken into fact of that matrix? So not just looking at the value, the occupancy, the potential alternative uses for the council to dispose of that, but also looking at the overall approach to decide which ones would be first. And on that basis, obviously there's more data that could be put in there, but on that basis, it's quite hard to see a logical argument as to why you wouldn't go ahead with the removal of sites that have higher value, are more disruptive to the neighbours, places like Marygate and the other ones which are in a residential area have got potential alternative attractive uses that will provide homes or whatever it might be for the city, as compared to somewhere which is a floodplain, and the only alternative use for it is a floodplain.
I suspect that may be up for debate, but that isn't the point of the column here.
I was trying to respond to your point about the actual decisions and that time sequence of looking at different sites, why we've got in the strategic review all that data.
Well, and I think that is, again, the nub of things, isn't it? Is that there's been a number of concerns raised about the data that's here in this approved strategic review, and so once it's approved, it's then that's where the call-in lies, isn't it? But I think there certainly has been a number of alternative uses put forward for St George's Field, and I think even the My Castle Gateway, there was a conversation about not turning the back on the river and making more use of the Foss Basin and all of those sorts of things. So I think it's a bit difficult if we start talking in defined terms on those sort of things. I'm going to go to Councillor Musson next.
Thank you, Chair. I think we're really lucky that we've got such a strong academic knowledge within York about this subject, and I really enjoyed the public speakers, and that's why it's kind of unfortunate that I feel their intelligence has almost been insulted a little bit, because in this report, on page 13, the summary of the review that's gone to executive, it says that the objective of this review is to create a hierarchy of council car parks to inform immediate investment decisions. So to me, that means this is the hierarchy and we will use it as of now to make decisions. But in this meeting, we're being told, well, actually, the hierarchy can change and we're going to get more data. But can you see why any member of the public reading that would think actually they're moving ahead with this set of data in this hierarchy as of the approval of that decision? I think it's misleading to then just say we're going to amend things, because that's not implied in the decision that's actually been agreed in the notes of the meeting. I mean, also, I just think I would like to go back really to the original points that were made, which is page 30, the executive commissioned the strategic review of council car parking to help inform the decision as whether to proceed. We've heard from Councillor Kilbane about what was asked for from a report. To me, if you ask for a report on something and what you get is something else, i.e. not a strategic review, but a review on whether or not it would be great to turn a car park into a student accommodation block, that to me raises serious questions. How can you then move forward with any decision based on that report? I mean, unless we're saying that this strategic review is part one and it's going to be amended before February to include actually like all the correct information and reflect actually the strategic things that all the public speakers have mentioned tonight, I don't know how we can say that it's approved as a strategic review, because it's not a strategic review in my mind, and clearly in the minds of many others. But I just think we shouldn't be misleading people. If this report says that it is going to create this immediate hierarchy, which is going to be used going forward to dictate investment, to say that actually it's not binding and we're going to change it, which is it? Because to me, it's confusing. And if it's confusing to me, I'm not an expert, then it should be less confusing to the public. Thank you.
I'm not sure what the question was, but the answer I would give is to look at pages 40 and 41 of the strategic review, which clearly says that it will change. There's nothing hidden in the report that says this is set in aspic. It clearly says provide an improved evidence base for future decision making, identify where the data is lacking, and cease to fill those gaps. That's what you're being. That's what we were asked to approve a report that highlighted those gaps, which have been highlighted, and more gaps have been highlighted as part of that. So the review has been incredibly successful, and I take exception to you saying anyone has been insulted in this room, because nobody has been insulted. And the very fact that this review has happened has got those individuals to speak at this meeting and raise some of that data. So that information has been captured as a result of the work that this review has done. And that is very valued information. All the information we receive is valid, and nobody in this room said anything otherwise.
Councillor Musson, I think you
Thank
wanted
you.
a supplementary.
It's just that you've said this is going to be future decision making, and then the report to executive says immediate investment decisions. So this further data that you talk about, and actually it's really encouraging if that's going to happen, is that going to come before February when the decision about it is due? Because that seems like a lot of data and issues that need to be worked through before February, given that we are, you know, in December and holidays and all that.
I mean, I hate to use the word hierarchy again, but there's seems to be the word of the day, but there is a hierarchy of decision making. And that's what I was trying to allude to further. So when it says about immediate decisions, that would be things such as, do we need more disabled car parking spaces in particular car parks? Do we need to rapidly improve the servicing on that? Again, we have a decision-making process, so such decisions would go through the council decision-making process, would be approved by the executive member for transport based on the information within this report. If anybody thought, for example, if we were proposing £25,000 to resurface part of Monk Bar car park, based on this hierarchy, and someone was to attend that meeting and say, well, actually, that particular data in that is flawed, we don't think you should spend £25,000 resurfacing that particular bit of that car park, you should go and do it on the other side of the city. We have a decision-making process to do that. The more significant strategic decisions, such as, for example, whether you go ahead with St George's Field, clearly has to come, and this will be only part of that decision. There will be, as Councillor Crawshaw was alluded to, significant other issues around that, around the things. That's when the conflation with Castle Car Park will happen. A lot of those conversations, whether that funding is necessary, whether the funding isn't necessary, huge amounts of information that would go forward to that decision. So no, a decision of that size to go ahead with such a major capital programme would never go ahead on the basis purely of a strategic review of parking as is here. That would be a wider one, but you have to take the decision. The immediacy is around very small scale decisions. There is no immediacy around key decisions in the city, which have their own democratic process they have to follow.
So I will come to you, Councillor Douglas, but I'm just a little bit confused now about timing, because the decision that was taken on the 18th at number 4, which everybody's making a point of saying, oh, it's just a note that a future report will come forward, but that future report will make a decision, presumably with recommendations as to whether or not to recommence the paused procurement of a contractor to build St George's Field multi-storey car park. So that will be a decision as to whether to go ahead or not in February. Now, you've accepted repeatedly that there's huge holes in the data in this strategic review that's been approved by executive. And I think the point that's been made repeatedly is that how can we approve a review that has got all of these huge holes? And you're saying, well, actually it's fine, because until we get to a point where we're going to have any major decision, we're going to get all of this information together, and all of these people who've contributed will help. Now, I think the point that Councillor Musson made is a very valid one, that I don't know the exact date of executive, but I'm guessing it'll be in the middle of February. We're now into December, we have budget to get through. Do you realistically think that there will be a significant transformation in the data available within the strategic review of car parking by February for you to be able to make a decision on whether or not to recommence the paused procurement of a contractor to build St George's Field multi-storey car park? Because I think that's kind of the nub of what this call-in is about.
Yeah, the call-in is trying to call in a February decision, is what it's trying to do. It's not even on the forward plan yet. That's the current timeline. If that timeline can't be met for any reason, that timeline would not be met. I think the original timeline was October.
But Councillor, do you understand the point that I think is being made is that the executive has voted to approve a strategic review of car parking on the data that's available. And you're saying you're accepting that the data's not great, that there's some great big gaps in it, and that we need more information.
That's not what I said. I said data can be improved. Data can always be improved.
So you think that the data is acceptable and it's fine as it is?
I haven't seen the report on St George's Field, so I don't know whether the data in the report on St George's Field is adequate or not. When the report on St George's Field is on the forward plan and the report is then written and comes to me as an executive member, I will take the decision on whether I think the information within that report is adequate to make the decision. At
But
the moment,
one of the key planks
I'm staring
will
at space and going, could be, might not be. That's not the way we make decisions. We have a report, we look at the evidence, and then we make a decision based on the evidence. We don't say 2 months hence, I actually think that report is going to be no good, so I'm not going to take a decision on it, which is in essence what this calling is saying. We don't think that report in February will be any good, therefore you shouldn't have the report.
No, I think that's a misrepresentation of the call, and I think it's really important that we're clear on this. Executive have approved a car parking strategy. We all accept that. And that strategy will be one of the key things which will inform the decision on whether or not the multi-storey car park goes ahead in February. We accept that?
It will be a part of the report,
One of the key. So it says here, to consider whether to proceed with St George's Field multi-storey car park in light of the outcomes of the strategic review of the council car parking. That's the review that you've approved. A review of the business case. There'll be another piece of document with the business case, and wider progress of the master plan, which is the whole Castle Gateway strategy. So it's one of the 3 key documents.
Far more than 3 key documents. I mean, the case, as it says, the wider review of the Castle Gateway, that is a huge interlinking project. I mean, there's the design documents for all of the housing that's being delivered as well, which will involve Councillor Craghill. There will be a lot of information brought forward as part of that decision of whether to go ahead and how we go ahead with the Castle Gateway project, which includes the Eye of York as well. That is part of that. The decisions that are made around the levelling up funding are key parts of that as well. So that there will be huge amounts of information to go into that report. This will be part of it, and this will evolve between now and then, undoubtedly. But I'm not going to sit here and say, I'm not going to take a report in February because we don't think it's adequate when it hasn't even been started.
I am going to move us on from this because I think we'll end up going round and round in circles. But I think that the key point is, if you're going to make a decision about whether or not to build a multi-storey car park, presumably the strategic review of car parking will be one of the most important documents within that decision making, which will inform the business case and will inform any of the other things that would be consideration. And I suppose I'm asking you is, you've accepted that there may be room for improvement within the strategic review of car parking. Given the timeline between now and the decision in the middle of February, do you believe that there is sufficient time to plug any holes, gather any additional data, make all of those recommendations or amendments that a number of very high caliber experts are suggesting may be needed, plus any other comments or input from this committee and officers and anybody else? Do you think that that is enough time so that executive is in as strong a position as it possibly can be come the middle of February?
Simple answer, Councillor Crawshaw, that is not my job. We have highly paid officers in this council to make those decisions. When those decisions are done and reports are made, recommendations will come forward to us to make a decision. If at that point I don't think there's adequate information to make that decision, I will not make the decision. But it's not for me to say to officers what they will be doing between now and then, what they can prioritise, whether they can or can't do any of that information. They will make that decision themselves. They are very adequate professional people that we have, that we pay good money to do that work for us, and they should be allowed to get ahead, do the job that we pay them to do, and allow us to do the job that we were elected to do, which is to make the decision based on the evidence we're given, not speculate and criticise before something has even been written.
Okay, I think Councillor Pearson, you put your hand up possibly as a supplementary, but I also had you next on my list as a substantive question. So did you want to make a supplementary question, and then I will come to you with your substantive if you still have one?
No, I was just concerned that we were straying from the route of the calling, but I don't. No further questions from me. Thank you.
And did you have a substantive question, or has that now been answered? Okay, so unless anybody else has any further questions for either of the executive members, I'll just give you perhaps the same as I did with Councillor Kilbane, just a minute or two just to summarise your position in terms of this call-in and this decision, and then thank you for your time.
It's up to you, Andy. I think I said a lot. I'll give you a chance.
I think just in summary, we've made clear that there's a strategic review and an action plan, which will add to the evidence base that's the decision that's been taken, is to approve the strategic review and the action plan. If there are issues that you feel are inadequate when that comes forward as part of the evidence base of the decision, then obviously that is some prerogative of councillors to call that in for review. But on the basis of what we put forward, there is no grounds for a review of the decision, particularly as I say, the action plan seems to be, nobody has said any fault that they find with the action plan. And then the second point, which has just been labouring significantly, is about the noting a future report, which we haven't, as has been said, is not yet even on the forward plan. And whatever evidence will go into that will include what we've got here, but it will include lots of other information which we don't have available at the moment, in which case there's not really much point in the executive reconsidering something that it's decided to note.
I think I'd be incredibly brief and just say that on that call in 3, as we've said, it's an evolving document. Improvements can be made. The action plan sets out how to make those improvements. So everything that the call in wants is actually included in the action plan. So it's not necessary. The latter one is that existential crisis of please don't refer it back to me to unnote something, because I'm absolutely unclear how I can possibly erase my memory in a sort of memento style to not note the report that I've already noted. And obviously the wider issues around St George's Field, as with every time I've been to this committee, I'm always welcome to take, whether we call it pre-decision scrutiny or pre-decision calling. I'm happy for those reports when they are available to come to scrutiny before coming to exec and get scrutiny's input in, so we don't have to go through this process. That's the issue. Some people will not agree with the car park, some people do. That issue will only be bottomed in that report, and that's when we should have proper scrutiny on it, and I would welcome that ahead of any particular executive seeing that one.
Thank you both. I'm going to draw an end to questions for this section. So thank you both for your time this evening. If I could now invite, we have 3 officers with us. Would you mind just sitting along that end, if that's all right? Just because I think it's easier for the committee members to all see you if you're down at that end. Just while you're getting yourselves settled, I will introduce you all. So we have Neil Ferris, who is Chief Officer responsible for the report to the Executive and is the Corporate Director for Economy and Place. We have James Gilchrist, who I'm trying to read your title, Director of Transport. And
it's wrong.
Andy Kerr, who is the Head of Regeneration and Economy. And I think my eyesight is possibly being strained to its extent. So again, I think perhaps what would be helpful is you'll have obviously heard members asking various questions, and I think it is key that this section is just about the technicalities of the report and technicalities of data gathering and all of those sorts of things. So perhaps if you could just answer any questions, if there's been any sort of specific ones that you've noted, and then just talk to us about putting together the report, and then obviously if the members do have any specific questions, I'll ask them to put them to you.
Thank you, Councillor Grosh. I'll be brief. I think one of my primary duties as corporate director is to make sure that executive make fully informed decisions and that they understand the decisions they're making and the deficiencies in the information that is provided to them, because there is always deficiencies in information. I can say that from the testimonies of the 2 executive members, they have thoroughly understood the executive report in front of them, as we as officers understood the information being presented to them. So I think that in that regard, it just reassures me that they understood the decision and the extent and deficiencies of the information that was provided for them when they made their decision.
Yeah, I think I'd just pick up generally to say that I think in starting the process, we knew there were elements of our parking data which had gaps in it. So one of the key things, the key outcomes of the study, which was set before the study commenced, were to provide an improved evidence base for future decision making. So what we did was review the evidence that we had. We've used the best data that we've got available, and we've identified where there's gaps and how that can be improved to then inform future decision making through LTP4. So that was one of the key priorities of the piece of work. identify strategic priority council car parks for investment and retention should parking decline in the future, and optimise and future-proof council car parks, including revenue considerations. So those key elements were picked up in that review and how we took it forward and are picked up in the action plan. I think the only other key point I'd make is that the hierarchy that's created, the vast majority of that hierarchy, if you work across it in the priority questions, aren't based on data. They are again actually based on sort of location of the car parks, its impact on residential communities, land value, and whether it's got alternative uses which could reduce pressure on greenbelt development, and works across in that way. So the majority of the hierarchy isn't actually based on data sets, which will be improved as we implement things like pay on exit and others. And the key point is that it's purely a framework to guide future investment decisions. Any key investment decision would need its own full business case, its own executive approval. So it sits there really to just say where priorities of car parks could be in the process.
Thank you. I don't know, James, if you had any comments at this point, or
not really. I mean, just to reinforce that point, that's at para 47 of the original exec report, that actually that point that future decisions would need their business cases developing beyond what's in the strategic review of parking.
Thank you. So members, if any of you have any questions, I can see Councillor Fenton and then Councillor Douglas.
Thank you, Chair. Quite a few of the public speakers were talking about the sort of the deficiencies in some of the data that was referred to in the report, which I think, listening to the executive members, they kind of accepted and pointed to the action plan. I suppose the question that I would ask to just so I'm sure is that the deficiencies in the data obviously were known. Was there data available that you chose not to include in the report, or choose not to use in producing the report that went to executive? Just to really bottom out, if the report is based on the data that was available, was there other data that you chose not to use?
So I think our most accurate assessment of data that we've got at the moment is revenue from our car parks, but we have used CCTV data as well. Effectively, we looked at all the data sets we've got, and we've picked out the data sets that are most robust at this point in time and applied those. So there were other data sets, but we didn't include them in the report because we didn't feel they were accurate enough. We've taken the data sets that we've got, which are, and we've obviously within the action plan looked at ways in which we can continue to improve those data sets moving forward.
Thank you. Councillor Rowley, is that supplementary? Yeah, Councillor Rowley.
It's also along the lines of the question I was going to ask, so you can cross me off your list. So gentlemen, obviously there are a number of sites that you looked at, and you've mentioned about data and data sets. Can you assure us as a committee that there was a uniform strategic approach to every single car park, or were there different approaches for different car parks? And if the latter is the case, that is somewhat concerning. That, you know, if I'm going to measure a field, for example, I'll measure every single field using the same measure. And so I'm just curious as to whether that same measure was used for every single car park. And you talked about data sets, and so were some data sets weighted more for one car park than another? There are certain data gathering equipment that wasn't used in certain places. I'm just concerned about the uniformity of the data gathering across all the sites.
So we've used the best data sets that we had available at that point in time. So for example, Castle Car Park wasn't included because it wasn't 2019, it wasn't in operation, a big chunk of it because of the Rose Theatre, so there wasn't a direct comparator to take one. And in terms of the CCTV data for Piccadilly, we don't have that because we're collecting the new pay on exit data. So we will have a robust data set for that car park that flow from that pay on exit data that we're starting to receive. But we have got revenue data for that, so that filled that gap. But we didn't have the data for that car park, so we couldn't include it.
Sorry. Okay. So the answer is that there were different data gathering systems for different car parks. So there wasn't a uniformed way of gathering that information.
They were gathered uniformly, definitely. So we've got CCTV, we've got revenue data in there, but on that car park, we didn't have the data on the CCTV piece because it was just not collected in the same way.
I think just to pick up on that, I think because the technology in the car parks isn't uniform, the data by definition isn't necessarily always uniform as well, which, as Andy's alluded to, we've got different ways of painting different car parks. So that adds to the challenge of presenting information uniformly. And it was always meant to be a review of city centre car parking. So we heard before that Moor Lane wasn't included. Well, that's not city centre. We did add in park and ride sites because we felt they were part of the transport into the city centre, so they were part of that analysis, and that's the reason for that.
Go on, one further one.
Well, I'm going to be very careful how I word this so that it is not in any way an accusation at anybody, but the way in which the data is gathered would give the opportunity for that data to be manipulated should anybody wish to do that.
I don't think that's the case. I think we've got different data sets. We've presented the best data we've got on those car parks.
I would just add as well that Annex 1 to the strategic review was an additional 50-page annex which goes into every car park in detail. So all the data's there, so it can be clearly seen. Neil?
Yeah, and just refer people back to Andy's opening comments. The vast majority of the information in terms of the hierarchy that was derived wasn't derived from data. If you look at the weightings on paragraph 49, the vast majority of it is self-evident. You go out and you can see where it is. Its land values are assessed by our commercial team as what the land values for those properties would be. So whilst you're talking about potential discrepancies between individual car parkings and the method of measurements, which I would acknowledge, as James has, that the data collection is different, in terms of the overall impact on the weighting, the majority of this is actually issues that you as members are concerned about, i.e. is it within the inner ring road, fulfilling that car-free city centre resolution of full council, is it impacted on residential properties, and what's its commercial alternative use, potential residential or societal alternative uses, and that's the predominant weight that's been derived in this analysis. And I think in terms of Professor Tony May's opening remarks in terms of is this an asset review, I think again you turn to the summary at the very start of the report that was presented to executive. It talks about the second is to create a hierarchy of council car parks to inform immediate investment decisions and how to respond should there be any future natural or policy-driven decline in parking demand. And I think for me, why I opened with the fact that the executive members had understood the decision that they were making is that they both reiterated that point, that it was actually a asset-based report, and it effectively informed decision making should there be a decline in parking in the future, which Councillor de Gorn quite described very well in terms of, well, if we were to say that we wanted to reduce our car parking by 20%, how might we inform that decision? And as Councillor noted, this is one part of that decision-making hierarchy that they would take into account when they made that decision. But clearly it would be for the executive at that time to determine whether they got enough information or not. But this is a tool to aid that decision. And the data, and I think this is the point when we start to discuss, will there be sufficient data for a February decision, a March decision, or whenever that decision is made, is the data is actually a very small part of the overall decision making that we will be looking to make around St George's Field car park. Actually, predominantly, it will be the issues that gets you out of bed every morning in terms of being representing the people of York. And that's not whether or not car park makes £10 or £20 per space. It's about the impact it has on residents and your overall strategic objectives for the city.
Is that supplementary, Councillor Marsden? I will just come to you in 1 second. I guess then the logical follow-on from that is some of the other conversation that's been had around whether or not it's appropriate to have a car parking strategy that precedes the LTP4, given that if we're predominantly looking at whether or not it meets our strategy for the city overall, and we're not looking at parking revenue and we're not looking at those sorts of things, how can we possibly make decisions about multi-storey car parks that could be here for the next 15, 20, 30 years, when we don't actually know what our main strategy is for the city centre and for the wider city in terms of moving around, because we haven't yet undertaken, whether it be LTP4 or the 2023 strategy to remove non-essential vehicles from within the city walls. Those things surely would be the primary drivers for whether or not we need more or less the same number of car parks.
So just to review, the Planning Committee made the recommendation in respect of a strategic review of car parking. Planning Committee does not make those decisions, but the executive member for Transport subsequently made that decision in April and set the scope of the review. That scope is one that has been fulfilled with this report, and executive will determine whether or not there is sufficient information or not to make the decision on St George's Field car park. But I would point out we do have a local transport plan extant already. It exists and it is extant until 2031 is its current timetable, and it does put cars at the bottom of the hierarchy, and there is the full council resolution on reducing car parking in the city centre. So we do have a policy framework within which officers are producing reports such as this at the direction of members, and clearly members will make the decisions as to whether or not there's sufficient information at the time they come to make those decisions.
Thank you. Councillor Musson, I think you had a supplementary, and then I will come to you, Councillor Douglas.
Thank you, Chair. Take your point about, that there are other things considered, not just data, but there have actually been, quite rightly so, some, I don't want to say errors because I think it's not black and white, but discrepancies, holes, whatever word you want to use in terms of those community issues that you talk about forming the rest of the analysis, and also some of the analysis itself and the strategic issues that are missing. So it's not just the data that I think people have an issue with. I think it's other parts of the report as well.
I think just to pick up on that point about residential communities, we very clearly looked at car parks which were accessed directly off the inner ring road, effectively, and we said that they had a lesser impact on residential communities. I mean, all our arterial routes into the city have residential homes along them, whether that be Tadcaster Road, Fulford Road, or whichever, but somewhere like Nunnery Lane, somewhere like St George's Field are accessed directly off that inner ring road. But when you move to car parks like, say, Monkgate or to Marygate, they have a much more significant impact on small residential communities where vehicles have to travel through them. So that was how we've assessed that in terms of the hierarchy as the impact it has on those communities.
Okay, Councillor Douglas.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to make sure that I'm absolutely clear about this. So this report that is the strategic car parking review is about asset management. It's not about transport planning and planning for the future of movement of cars in and out of our city and how we also use that to stimulate economy, etc. Is that correct?
It's as per paragraph 3 in the report. It's a hierarchy of council car parks to inform immediate investment decisions, and should there be any natural or policy driven decline in parking demand, the council can take a view as to which car parks it wishes to effectively take decisions to dispose of earlier or invest in, as in Councillor Ayer's response in terms of white lining, etc. It isn't, and to be clear, it isn't a full review of all car parking demand across the city, has been highlighted by members around the board. It doesn't include the car parking data, for example, for the private sector, or any demand analysis. But as I pointed out previously, in respect to the decisions potentially due on LTP4, etc., then data will only be a small part of that. Our decisions will be driven by yourself and your perspectives on what you want to deliver on behalf of your communities.
Councillor Douglas.
Thank you, Chair. As a follow-up then, so therefore the resolution 4 is about using this report to make a decision on whether St George's Field MSCP moves ahead in February, and there will be no transport consideration in that decision.
Resolution 4 is that a future report will be brought. So the actual substantive word in there is to note a future report will be brought, and then the reason for noting that a future report will be brought is that a future report will need to consider the strategic review of council car parking, the business case, and the wider progress of the master plan. So effectively, the decision at 4 is to note that this will form part of that decision making. Doesn't necessarily provide a definitive list of the data or the information that will be necessary to undertake that information. Only executive can determine what they wish or do not wish to be informed of in terms of making the decision. Officers will have a duty to make sure that they've got sufficient information to make a legally robust decision.
Just 1 second. Andy, did you want to comment as well? And then I will come back to you, Councillor Douglas.
Yeah, I was just going to stress again that in the exec report, paragraph 47, and also in the review, it says the hierarchy is to be used as a tool to indicate priority car parks for investment, and which car parks may be appropriate for alternative uses. It's not a definitive decision-making tool. Any future decisions on investment or alternative uses will be subject to individual business cases and executive decisions. So it's helping to guide that decision, but it is not a definitive decision based on that. It will be a separate exec report with its own full report and business case, and exec will make a decision on that basis.
Councillor Douglas.
Thank you. So we're absolutely clear for everybody who's here today and listening then. Will any transport considerations be put forward in that decision making around St George's Field car park, or will it just be asset management decision and data? Thank you.
Clearly there'll be transport making decisions because we have a local transport 3, which effectively determines a hierarchy of policy, and we have full council resolutions. So there will be a number of transport aspects involved in that decision. Whether there will be data-driven decisions will be a matter for members to determine how they wish to drive that decision forward. We will provide information as is available at that time.
Thank you. I've got 3 people with substantive questions, and then I've got 1 for myself, and then I'm going to start to draw this to a close. So Councillor Musson, I think you had a substantive question as well, and then I've got Councillor Fenton and Councillor Pearson.
It's all right. It's been answered in the last 5 minutes.
Thank you. In which case, Councillor Fenton.
Thank you, Chair. I asked the executive member for transport about the interaction between the action plan and LTP4, and Andy, you helped to explain the hierarchy and how it was configured. I just wondered what you see as the role that the hierarchy will play in informing LTP4. What does it contain that will help inform that process?
Well, I think particularly the action plan. So in the action plan, the parking review objectives are sort of set out in the last column. And we've got a number of those which are around improving our evidence bases, which again is to reflect on how we can have better data sets to inform some of these decisions. So some of those things are around things like pay on exit, which give us much more accurate data on who's using car parks at what times and when. Again, looking at the potential to do the moving insights data that the bid do to expand that out, which gives us greater data on not only car park usage, but where people come from. So there's decisions that are set out there that'll be part of LTP4 as well. So it's around improving data sets effectively to aid that strategic decision making, and there's a number in there that do that within the action plan.
Okay, and Councillor Pearson.
Thanks, Chair, and thank you for the report you brought tonight. It's I just want to pick up this point on point 4, I think, of the call-in, which is around private car parks around the city. I just wondered if you could discuss as to what data we have on that, whether we're actually able to share any of that data, given that we are in competition with them, and just generally where you think that feeds into the strategy. Thank you.
Yeah, so I mean, the numbers in isolation have a benefit, but they don't answer the questions, obviously, in terms of occupancy and in terms of, we did have discussion with the bid, who've got closer relationships with those operators. But again, the key point being it's that commercial sensitivity. That's what they base their business models on. Most private car park operators wait to see what local authorities publicly set theirs at and can reflect and be flexible around those, as we are the major provider and therefore competitor in the city. So it's not data sets we can easily get our hands on.
What hasn't been mentioned tonight as well is residents parking. So we have a constant pressure within the transport team for increasing residents parking provision across the whole city. So we can see that there is significant parking demand, and that parking demand is continuing to put pressure on residential areas. So it's not just commercial operators, it's also the pressure that's been put on residents by parking outside the city to avoid the charges that both ourselves and private operators. So it's a very complex market when it comes to data. So hence my precautionary sort of words there in respect of how much weight we give to specific data. Is going to give definitive answers, either yes or no, depending on what your views as to what you'd like to see as an outcome are.
Thank you. So as I say, I've just got a couple of questions myself, and then we'll just wrap up this section. The initial premise to all of this was January 21, when the decision as to whether or not to proceed with St George's Field was paused, and it was paused on the basis of wanting to better understand what the impact of COVID would be. So we're now seem to be at a position where we've approved a strategic plan and we're looking to bring something forward to make a decision about whether or not to proceed with the multi-storey car park in February. So I'd like to understand really what we now think. Are we now in a position where we do better understand what the impact is on parking? In particular, I'm sort of noting that a lot of the data sets that have been used as the post-COVID are the sort of the summer holidays period in this last summer just gone. And obviously that's a summer that's been sort of characterised by a significant amount of domestic holidaying, and York, I think, has done particularly well from people travelling into the city. And I'm just wondering to what extent we think that the data and the figures and the demand that we're seeing, and it's referred to in a number of places in both the kind of cover report and the strategy overall about, you know, the demand is clearly bounced back. Is that a sustainable demand, do we think? I mean, have we got a sense of that? Because obviously if we're going to build a big car park, we need to know that it's not just going to be full next summer, but every single summer for the next however long. So I guess that's my first question, is just to better understand a little bit about what we know about that at the moment.
I don't think that we've quite got a new normal yet post-COVID. We still see lots of employers with levels of hybrid working. Some have made long-term decisions on that, some haven't. So I don't think we've necessarily got a long-term position on what transport modes will be like in the long term. So I don't think, in answer to that, necessarily we have got a long-term position on what a post-COVID world would look like. The advantage of the data sets we have got is that they can continue to be updated, because most of them aren't snapshots in time, they are data feeds that can be brought up to date.
That's helpful. And Neil, I will bring you in a second. I suppose what I want to really understand though is, to what extent do we think that the demand that we're referencing in this report and in this strategy, which is based on this summer just gone, do we have a sense of whether that is largely driven by internal domestic holiday making essentially, or do we think that that's just residents of the city using the car parks, so that's going to be there, you know, going forward?
I don't think we know, is the honest answer. I think there is undoubtedly a level of people not wanting to use public transport at the moment. So public transport is generally down and still remains down, and public transport is, and car usage is over where we were pre-COVID. So those two are probably in equilibrium. However, we know how hard the challenge is to get people to use public transport. So how long will it take to move that back? We just don't know. But I don't think we know in full detail the answer to those as a country, never mind as a city yet.
Neil, did you want to add?
Yeah. And I think the interesting point for that is I don't think we'll necessarily ever know, because you've got so many variables at play. So this is why, and I think the point was made earlier about why I enjoy my job and why I respect everything you do, is because actually decisions aren't made by black and white data saying you do A or B. It's actually decisions that shape the whole policy of how you wish to manage a city. So what demand there will be for the car park in St George's Field in terms of the multi-storey will be a judgment call by members. You are reducing the car parking that is existing in the city centre by over 100 spaces, 25% from if you remove Castle Car Park. The question for you is and the question for executive will be, does that strike the right balance in the context of the city's ambition for tourism, for retail, etc. How are you going to promote the park and ride? How is the country going to promote the use of rail going forward in light of the decisions made in respect of the removal of HS2 Eastern Leg? If we get the proposed station at Haxby, will that have a significant impact on people coming from the northwest into the city in terms of their preference for coming into the city and parking or park out at Haxby? The data will be incomplete. It will not provide a crystal ball as to what the future will be. It will require an executive to sit and make a judgment call as its view of the available data at that time, and it will not be perfect, and there will be no perfect time to make that decision.
Thanks. I think the only observation I would make on that comment, and I don't disagree with a lot of what you're saying, but I think if you have people with significant years of experience, and I'm thinking particularly of Professor Tony May, who I know has done a lot of work with the council, this is his bread and butter, and he's come on at the start of the meeting saying that this is
I would
been erroneously put together, I suppose.
I can understand that, and I would make the comment in respect to both of the comments from the professionals who are from Leeds University. They both made comments about carbon reduction. That makes a huge leap of judgment in respect of a reverse look as to carbon-based transport being cars. Cars going forward will not necessarily be carbon-based. So again, it comes back to policies, your view as members, and I'd be very wary of reflecting to members that you will take the views of experts and say that they're the right things to be made, decisions to be made on your behalf. It's about actually listening to those expert views, which is really important, but predominantly it's about how you wish your city to look and how you wish it to feel going forward, taking into account a whole variety of information, not just the data.
And I think obviously cars construction is obviously a carbon element as well as emissions, which I think is often lost in this thing. Just one other thing that I wanted to just ask you about, and then I will close this section. There's just a couple of sort of what feel to me like assumptions that I don't think have got enough information behind them to be able to say in this report. And it's, I suppose, summarised, paragraph 42, page 25 says, car parking has a role to play in a successful city centre economy. It's said 2 or 3 times throughout the strategic review that car parking is a significant, or is a part of the thriving city centre economy. It also talks about the need to have car parking to offset out of town car parking, and an assumption that people might drive into the city centre and not out to wherever it is, and that therefore would be a shorter journey. Whereas another argument might be, well, actually, if you discourage people from driving, an extra 2 or 3 people, or maybe even more, might ride or walk. And so I just wondered where that sort of assertion had come from, because it's come up 2 or 3 times in both the cover report and in the strategy. And I'd just be interested to know, again, what backs that up to be able to make that assertion.
I mean, James might to pick up from a transport perspective in a bit more detail, but certainly all the engagement that we did, particularly when we're doing the My Castle Gateway master plan, very strong voices in those processes around the need for city centre car parking, as well as people saying they don't want any car parking, and the real striking and balance that sits between those different bits. So it's a key part of the public engagement that we've had through the My Castle Gateway project and when we've had the My City Centre project recently. So it's obviously striking that balance between people who would like no car parking, some who would like lots of car parking. If we talk to businesses, I mean, for example, when we were doing the project, something like Phoenix, for example, only supported the Castle Gateway master plan if there was going to be replacement car parking provided in whatever guise that would be. So that's just to pick one example within the business community as well.
I think just from on a very York specific sort of example, I think, you know, one of the hierarchy questions is about EV. Car parks play a part, and city centre car parks particularly play an important part in our EV strategy. There where we expect residents, particularly those who live on tight terrace streets, to charge EVs at the moment, and that's part of our adopted strategy. So city centre car parks serve multiple purposes, and I think that's part of the challenge of what we're looking at in terms of car parks in the round. They're not just about people parking during the day, they're increasingly about EV parking at night as well.
The only thing I would ask members to reflect on is your experience of York's car parks this summer. Unfortunately, the domestic private motor vehicle is still a preferred mode of transport for lots of families across the UK, and that's been reflected in our car parks having some of the highest revenues that they've had ever throughout this summer. So absolutely the strategic objectives, but then there is the reality of behavioural change and taking people with us. The car is still very much used and favoured by the public at large.
Thank you very much for your comments and input. I appreciate you coming. I'm going to move us on from that and into a very brief, I think, probably debate, and then we need to get to voting. I'm conscious that we do need to try to be out of this room by 8 o'clock if we possibly can be. So I think what I would like to do is just go around the table. Obviously, the way that this works is we don't necessarily put forward our opinions as to the merits of the call-in at this stage. It's more about what are the things that you wish to consider, what are the things, are you satisfied that you've had enough information on, all of those sorts of things. And then we'll go around everybody asking for their views on the merits of the call-in or otherwise. So if anybody has any comments or any issues that they wish to raise in that sort of general debate, now is your time. Looks like we're eager to get into the main bit. Councillor Musson.
Thanks, Chair. We had a few comments. Well, we had some opposing comments. Some people think this call-in is too premature, and some people seem to be saying it's coming too late. So I think just on the validity of the call-in, I mean, we had one in February 2020 about inclusive growth. About a decision that was made that was underpinned by a strategic document that had been approved by executive several months earlier. And in that call-in, we were discussing various parts of it. And at many points during that, we were informed you can't consider this objection to the decision because it's underpinned by the strategic document, which was approved several months ago. And if you wanted to question the validity of that, then you should have called that in. So I think we do get ourselves in quite a kerfuffle, and I don't think saying that something is invalid to discuss when it's titled strategic review and it has an action plan and the resolution says that the outcomes from that are going to be the basis or heavily informing later decisions. I don't think it's actually invalid to question any of the statements or data underpinning something that's called a strategic review about something, because I'm sure if in February a call-in had been made about the decision, if it happens in February, we might well have been told, well, it's informed by this review, and no one was criticising it at that point in time. So I understand people's concerns, but I don't think questioning the validity of it was is that really useful to make, to be honest. I think people have fair points about the points of the report that were approved on the 18th. Thanks.
Councillor Fenton.
Yeah, I think we've had more of a deep dive into what the review covers, what it hasn't covered, and where the gaps are. And I think that's been useful for everyone, and certainly so that helped develop my understanding. I think the key thing for me is, that there is an action plan. There are lots of action plans at the moment, but there is an action plan in regard to the strategic review to identify, having identified where the gaps, looking at how we can fill the gaps. And I take on board the comments by officers that data forms a part of the hierarchy and the matrix that we've been discussing. It's been helpful to slightly unpack some of the issues around the multi-storey car park and understanding where the strategic review will fit in. Obviously, we as Scrutiny, we no doubt will want to pay close attention to when that comes to fruition in the form of a report, and I welcome the Councillor Ayres' comment around welcoming pre-decision scrutiny, and that's something that I think we should bear in mind. But yeah, it's been an interesting and useful discussion.
Councillor Douglas.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I definitely think it has. It's really illuminated quite a lot of the specific drivers behind this review, and I think that likely has helped us all. But I don't think that it necessarily detracts from the fact that this review is going to be used for significant decisions, and likely not just the St George's multi-storey car park, which is featured here, but many others as well. And I think, therefore, that we need to consider whether we think that it could be improved and whether we want to make recommendations as to what we think that could be. Because at the end of the day, it's to all of our benefit for the council to make good decisions that are well informed and can stand the test of time, and our residents have trust in. And at the end of the day, that's what we should all be aiming to do. So I think that there are some recommendations that we could make along those lines that would improve this report and help in subsequent decision making. Thank you.
Councillor Rowley.
Thank you, Chair. I think what's been, so our role as a scrutiny committee is to obviously scrutinise decisions, but also to hold executive members to account in terms of the decisions that they make. And looking at this report, it is clear that there are deficiencies in it. And again, we're not going to debate the validity of the calling or not. But I think it is clear, and I would have to say that I was pleased that the executive members accepted that there were some deficiencies in the report. And I guess for me, it's about ensuring that if we make any recommendations as a committee, that it's around just ensuring that those deficiencies and those gaps in data actually are followed through. And so for me, the essence of any recommendation will be just to ensure that the executive look at a report that actually, I mean, and again, Councillor Eyre referred to it in terms of, the moving forward, the evidence-based, collate all the existing evidence data, identify and implement measures to improve further evidence base. And I think for me, the importance is just ensuring that any recommendations we make are geared more around, ensuring that any report that they use to make decisions actually is a lot more inclusive than what we've currently got.
Councillor Fenton, did you want to come back?
Yeah, just briefly to to reflect on those comments. And I think if we didn't have if there wasn't an action plan that was part of the strategic review, then I think we were probably recommending a whole range of things that we would be asking the executive to ask officers to do to fill the gaps that have been identified. But I'm comforted by the fact that there is the action plan, that it's then a case of delivering that. And then when it comes to these key decision points, looking at the extent to which additional information has been able to be gathered to support those key decisions, which as we've alluded to. But in terms of recommendations, I think the action plan, to my mind at least, sort of fulfills that need.
Okay, I'll just make a couple of observations. The first is that we as a committee don't often have lots of public speakers coming to address the committee. And we've had a couple of occasions recently where we've had significant numbers of very highly qualified people in the area of the subject matter that we're discussing coming and saying in very well-reasoned terms, you are getting this wrong. And I think that whether or not the call-in fails or otherwise, falls or is upheld this evening, I think that that's something that we all ought to be reflecting upon, because actually there is a wealth of engaged and highly informed people in the city who do pay attention to what decisions are made by the council. And when those people are coming and saying, you are getting this wrong, they're not coming with an axe to grind particularly. They are usually coming as a friend who wants to help make the decision be got right. And whether or not it's around the accepting of the strategic review on car parking, or whether it's about the subsequent decision on the St George's Field multi-storey car park, or any of those other decisions which may have been made recently, I think that not taking on board and not listening and not welcoming that input would be folly, because I think that, as I say, I think people do come here with very strong intention. And I think if we are looking at making a several £million commitment to a car parking strategy, and people who are experts in the field are saying this isn't being done correctly, you've not got the right information to be able to make a decision on this, then I think that that's something that we should pay heed to. And I think, to my mind, when we are thinking about the call in itself, we are looking at an approved strategy. And whether or not there's an action plan that accompanies that or not, it is a strategy that has been approved and will then be taken into account as part of a decision-making process. I think we're probably reaching the climax of the evening, aren't we? So if we now move into the actual specifics of the call-in itself, if people wish to make any proposals or any comment on the merits of the call-in itself, now is your time, and I see Councillor Rowley straight in there.
Thank you, Chair. So from all that I've listened to and read, if I take item 4, I don't propose that we do anything with item 4. I'm quite comfortable that is laid aside. However, my concern is around item 3 and the acceptance of the strategic report, and just to acknowledge, yes, there is an action plan, and Councillor Fenton has quite rightly alluded to the fact that there's an action plan there. I am, as I said a moment ago, I am heartened that the executive member acknowledged that there were deficiencies in the report, and I just think that if we are going to make a recommendation, the recommendation is to recommend that the executive ensure that the gaps that have been clearly highlighted in the strategic report are addressed. So I wouldn't want to have a full root and branch reconsideration of it, but just an acknowledgement that the executive will actually look to address those gaps that have been clearly highlighted.
Councillor Douglas and then Councillor Musson.
I'd like to second that proposal.
Councillor Musson.
I would third it, but I mean, I'm a bit concerned that we're just asking them to do something that they've already said that they're going to do. As has been pointed out, maybe making a bit more specific, the key thing to me would be to say the executive should be satisfied that that has been addressed before undertaking certain kinds or certain sizes of decisions, because we know they're going to go away and do some improvements to the information. Is that going to happen in 6 months or is it going to happen in 3 years? And what decisions regarding car parks are going to be made in the time? So I think, yeah, recommend that they ensure that the improvements happen. But then what are we actually saying that needs to happen by? Because they've already said they're going to go away and do it. Hope that made sense. It's been a long day.
Councillor Fenton.
I think we've heard from the officers that the strategic review, like it or have reservations about it, is based on all of the data currently available. That's why I kind of asked the question, well, is there other stuff you could readily include that would answer some of the points that have been raised? And the response was, no, we've made use of the robust data that we have available. So I think sending it back to executive saying, well, find some more information which you may have to hand. What we've got is in terms of the data aspects of it is what's available. We know where the gaps are, and the action plan seek to address those. I think referring back to executive would obviously, it runs the risk of stalling the action plan, so it might have the reverse impact that we would want it to have. I think what members are saying is, take action as quickly as possible to address those gaps. There'll then be a future stage where, when it comes to the key decision points that Councillor Musson raised, members will have a view as to the extent to which the information provided and the gaps that are being filled by that point support whatever the recommendation is. And that's something that is hard for us to second guess at this stage. So I'm struggling to think of a reason to kick it back, because it's kind of already there.
Councillor Musson.
I really sympathise with what Councillor Fenton has just said, but if we resolve to take no action and accept that the report is approved as it is, the hierarchy is approved, and all the strategic assumptions that are in there stand, then we may well get to a decision where we're still not confident that this supports it fully. Councillors might choose to call it in, and actually it's underlined by the assumptions in this review, which we have kind of accepted are fine. So I'm just reliving this previous call-in, to be honest. But I don't know if there's some sort of joint statement that of all these things that you said that could be written that reflects that. We recommend that the action plan is proceeded with no matter what, as fast as possible, whatever, but stress that the executive bear in mind in future key decisions that the strategic overview in the report might need to be revisited following improvements, whatever the better worded version of that is. But I do think the action plan should be commenced with ASAP.
Councillor Douglas.
Yeah, I think the action plan should be commenced with immediately, and really a significant decision shouldn't be made until those elements of the action plan that relate to the deficiencies that we've heard about tonight are actually achieved. So it needs to be done before this decision that we've been told may be in February or may not, before that happens. So the two are related. The action plan to be carried out, the deficiencies filled, the gaps filled, and then the decision on St George's Field not made until that has been achieved. Thank you.
Councillor Hollier.
Thanks, Chair. It seems very strange to me to send an item back to executive, essentially with a recommendation that they do either what we all know they're going to do anyway, or what is already written in the report. So I won't be supporting this proposal.
Councillor Rowley.
I just want to say a couple of things. So firstly, if a calling gets sent back to the executive and there is a recommendation, I think we need to understand that the perception is that we are not being critical of the executive. We're not saying that they've got something wrong. We're simply saying, as a scrutiny committee, if we're minded to, that actually the report that you've approved, we want to ensure that the deficiencies that the executive members have accepted tonight are deficient within the report will be addressed. And I think, you know, the perception of asking the executive, it's not saying that you've got something wrong, because I don't think they have got something wrong. It's just saying, please, as a scrutiny committee, we have an overwhelming comments from learned members of the public, from professionals who've been advising in this area for many years, and an acceptance from executive members that there are omissions and that there are deficiencies. And yes, the action plan says to look at all, and it's just ensuring that is accepted, and any decisions that are made, understand that and ensure that those deficiencies that have been accepted are addressed. That's what I'm wanting to do. So I'm not wanting to be critical of the executive. I just want them to understand that as a scrutiny committee, we recognise the seriousness of those deficiencies that are clearly there, not in the report. Thank you, Chair.
Councillor Fenton, I'll allow you to respond, as I'm just having a little bit of deliberation here as well.
And I think we got that. Sorry, I got that from Councillor Ayres' response to the questions that were raised in terms of an acceptance. Is that reason enough to kick the decision back to executive? I don't think it is, because I think we've already got that. And if that isn't followed through, then this committee and others can ask questions as to why not. Just on the point of Councillor Douglas's point around almost kind of wanting to set kind of milestones that you would want to see reached before a report would come to executive and potentially pre-decision scrutiny on the multi-storey car park. I think if it comes to pre-decision scrutiny, this committee will want to have a view as to whether the data elements within any recommendation are strong enough and evidence-based. We heard from officers that there'll be an executive member sort of a range of issues to be considered, and I would imagine this committee would have a view as to whether we thought the data element of any recommendation was significantly robust to form part of a recommendation for either whatever that might be. So I wouldn't be in favour of us kicking it back to executive to set sort of key some action plan milestones. I'm not sure which ones we would want to prioritise, because I still don't feel as though I have a full understanding of what potential other data might be available. We've seen some of it in the action plan in terms of fixing or installing counters. There may be other data. We've had discussions. We've heard about discussions with the bid about access to some private car parking data that might form part of it. So again, from what I've heard, it's given me some assurance. I'm not sure that kicking it back to executive, asking them to with a defined set of milestones would necessarily be the right thing to do.
Councillor Pearson.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, I don't think I can support the proposed vote in terms of this is a strategic review. It's not a strategic plan, it's a strategic review. And that strategic review says, oh, we haven't quite got all the data we need, and we've got an action plan to try and address some of those issues. Our job as a scrutiny committee is to say, has a bad decision potentially been made? No bad decision has been made, so therefore I can't be in favour of this particular vote. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll just give you my brief thoughts, and then we've obviously had something proposed and seconded. I think there's a couple of things that were said that trouble me around a sort of acceptance of the status quo, and in particular a suggestion that well, because people like to drive their car and because there's demand in the car parks because people are not using public transport at the moment, that should then inform a decision about the strategy of the city and the way that the city operates. And to my mind, that's cart before the horse. It's the point that I think was made by at least one, or if not more, of the public speakers, that really, how can you possibly have a car parking strategy when we haven't got an up-to-date local transport plan? And I note the comments that were made about the fact that there is an existing local transport plan, but I think that everybody accepts that that is urgently in need of review. And the outcome of the review of the local transport plan may well tell us that actually we need more car parks in the city centre because we're going to get everybody driving in and we're going to abandon the park and ride. Or more likely, it will say, actually, we aren't doing anywhere near enough to encourage people out of their private vehicles. We need to make private vehicles the least attractive option for people getting into the city centre, apart from those who need to have a private vehicle. And then actually by removing people out of their cars and clearing the roads, we make the city more accessible for everybody. Where that then sits us with this evening, I think is difficult, because from my mind, I find it very difficult to accept that executive felt able to approve a car parking strategy which seems to be predicated on assumptions and information that is missing, and an assumption that we'll look at it again a bit further down the line. And that decision about St George's Field in February effectively will be taken in isolation, because it won't be part of a wider transport strategy or a wider car parking strategy, unless we're told, which I think Councillor Musson has alluded to, that actually the car parking strategy has been approved and it's gone through scrutiny, and you've all said that it's totally fine, and therefore it's perfectly fine to make this decision based on this car parking strategy. So I think that's where I feel in terms of that decision-making process. I don't feel that it's been particularly robust. I think what I do very much welcome is the offer from the exec members to ensure that there's thorough pre-decision on that decision around the St George's Field car park, whether or not it happens in February or at a later date. And likewise, I think that if it is to be a live document, this car parking strategy, then it may be something that, whether it be, it's probably not this committee, it's probably more suited to Economy in Place, but it may be a document that Scrutiny would want to keep regular checkbacks on, because I think that when executive approves a document, there's an assumption that it's set in stone. It's been said repeatedly that it's not set in stone and it's very much up for review or an ongoing thing. So I think that, you know, we need to have Scrutiny's input within that. As I say, it's been moved and seconded that we go back to executive with a set of recommendations as to how the strategy could be improved. I think we first of all need to take a vote on that as it is, and then depending on the outcome of that vote, we need to then consider whether there's anything else that we wish to do as a course of action. So Dawn, if I could go to you to conduct the vote.
Hi, Chair. I was just going to clarify first that was only on resolution 3, because I think there was an acceptance. Sorry, probably can't. Yeah, there was an acceptance, wasn't there, that you were going to just simply status quo on 4. Right.
That was what was proposed and seconded.
yep.
That was my understanding.
Yep.
Councillor Musson, did you want to comment?
Can I just check that after we do that proposal, there might be a further discussion about do this before making certain decisions? Because I made a point about, they already said they're going to do this. So what's the timeline for that? And how are we satisfied that that's been done before it's informing all these decisions that it says it's going to inform? Apologies to interrupt, but I didn't want us to.
Chair, I would suggest that you need to build into your proposal, with the acceptance of the mover and the seconder, what it is you want in that proposal to be considered now. Sorry, Janie, were you going to?
I would add to that you've already accepted the offer from the executive members for pre-decision, and that in itself builds into the time frame. So there needs to be a period of that, and we can't possibly dictate that at the moment because it's a little bit premature at the moment, because there's nothing on a forward plan and there's no report. So whatever time frame is available takes into account the offer from the executive of pre-decision, and that will naturally form a time frame.
I think the difficulty with that, if I've understood you correctly, Councillor Musson, apologies. It's clearly that time of the evening. I think the difficulty with that is that if what we're saying is that we want those reviews and that improved data and all of that stuff to happen in a timely way, that's distinct from the timeline around a decision on St George's Field car park. And so if we accept that we've been offered pre-decision on that specific decision, but I think it comes back to that point that I was making, which is to say that decision therefore then becomes a decision in isolation about that one particular car park. And what we're looking at in the wider round here is a strategy for all of the car parks in the city, and wishing to put some sort of time frame on when we will be improving this strategy with the data that's missing and the other criticisms that have perhaps been levelled at it.
Chair, I fully accept that, but one of the reasons for recommendation 4 is to consider whether to proceed with St George's Car Park in light of outcomes of the strategic review of council car parking. So the strategic review is going to be part of that process, because it's going to be part of the evidence base to make the decision, along with the wider progress of the master plan and business case, etc. And you've already heard officers indicate that there is the action plan to follow through and more evidence to obtain. So it's going to be quite a detailed decision. So you're not looking at one decision in isolation. You have to look at the evidence base that creates that recommendation, because the reasons for it's part and parcel of the reasons. It's just at the moment, we can't set a time frame because nothing's written. So
apart from the approved council car parking strategy, I think that's the problem in a way.
But there is an action plan which is further detailed, and you've already heard the officers and the executive members say it's an evolving document. So you've got this, and Councillor Fenton, I think, tried to say this is a point in time at the moment, but there may be future information to feed into this.
So I've got Councillor Musson and then Councillor Rowley.
Thanks, Chair. For me, this is the point, because the decision that was made is that the document as is going to be the basis for this decision. There's also part of an action plan that document's going to be improved. So, I mean, you're shaking your head. It's in the executive papers. So that's my point. That if we don't recommend that the action plan or aspects of it are done before that document is used to inform the decision, then the document as it stands will be used to inform that decision.
Councillor Rowley.
According to what's written here, at least.
Thank you, Chair. Just to make it clear, what I proposed a while back was that the executive member has admitted there were deficiencies in the strategic review. So my suggestion was...
Sorry, I just feel I need to... My interpretation of what the executive members responded to on that was not that they were accepting there were deficiencies, they were accepting that there were gaps, you know, based on the amount of data that was presently available. I just think there's a subtle difference, but...
Okay, I think, okay, so I'm more than happy to replace the word deficiencies. I think we're splitting hairs, deficiencies, gaps, you know, it's semantics. I'm happy to go with whatever wording you feel, but it was acknowledged that there were gaps in the report. Okay, and they've been highlighted by those public speakers and by others that have commented. So my suggestion is that we simply ask as a recommendation, we recommend that the executive, prior to using this report for any decisions that they make, give us an assurance that they will address those gaps. That's what I was asking. And that's nothing different from what the executive member, forgive me.
That's fundamental difference.
Okay. So if I may, and hopefully this is a simple summary, just for the benefit of you not being on the microphone and things. I think when I was maybe having some of that back and forth with Councillor Eyre, he was stressing that he accepted there was room for improvement without necessarily conceding that there was deficiency in the report. Would that? Okay, Councillor Eyre, come to the table quickly. Give us your verbatim.
It's a very key issue because the point I made was that there were gaps in the data. The report, there were no gaps in the report because the report pointed out there were gaps in the data. It's a gap in the data, not anything wrong with the report itself or the review itself, because the review and the report acknowledge that there were gaps in the data. So the report and review is fine. The data could be improved.
And I think that what Councillor Rowley is asking for is for those gaps to be filled before a decision is made.
I essentially, yes. I mean, you know, the public speakers made it very clear, and these are eminent public speakers, some of the areas of where the gaps are. And all I was wanting to do to help support the executive is for the executive to acknowledge that, you know, the contribution of these eminent speakers this evening, you know, be acknowledged in terms of, you know, that's where the gaps are, and that, you know, we give an assurance that we will look to, you know, address those gaps. I'm just trying to help. That's all.
Okay.
Fine.
So to try and get us over the line here, can we agree then that what the proposal is that this is sent back to executive with a recommendation that the acknowledged gaps are filled to the best extent possible in as timely a way as possible in order to make as robust a decision as possible on any future car park decision making? Would that be a summary that we're happy with? Okay, so that's been moved and seconded. So can we do a show of hands that all those in favour of the proposal as moved and seconded, for all those in favour, if you could show now. And all those against? And any abstention? Okay, so that proposal falls. If anybody would like to make any alternative proposals, Councillor Fenton.
Thank you, Chair. I'm happy to propose option A in the agenda pack on page 8 to decide there are no grounds to make specific recommendations to executive. I'm keen that officers get on with actioning the action plan, and I think option A would allow them to do that without delay and gather as much information as possible to help inform future decisions. So on that basis, would support option 5A.
Councillor Pearson.
Formally seconded.
Okay, so it's been proposed and seconded. So all those in favour of that proposal, if you could show now. And all those against? Okay, so that carries, and that confirms the decision taken by the executive on the 18th of November to approve the strategy. We as a committee then can't make any recommendations to executive, but I think we have suggested that we would like to look at the decision around the St George's Field, possibly as some form of pre-decision. So we'll review the work plan with a view to bringing that back. I'm just going to make an observation that the voting split in a way that I think would have been predictable from the start of this meeting. And it's a shame that we get through to this kind of time of an evening and find ourselves in the position that we are. Anyway, you'll be very pleased to know that there is no urgent business, and therefore thank you all for your time this evening, and that concludes our meeting.